What if the most powerful invention in human history was not fire, not the wheel, not even language, but the very first lie, long before kings, temples, empires, or written law? One false story may have changed the way human beings trusted, ruled, traded, and built civilization itself, because once people learned how to reshape reality inside another person's mind, history was never the same again. If you enjoy deep history, ancient mysteries, and the hidden forces that shaped our world, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. Now, let's go back to where it all may have begun. Night sits close to the ground in the old world. It gathers in the grass, in the tree line, in the black hollows between stones, and in the spaces between human beings when they're no longer certain what the others know. Firelight reaches only so far. Beyond it, the land remains a vast listening thing. Eyes shine and vanish. Wind moves through reeds with the soft hiss of something alive. A child stirs in sleep. A woman turns her head toward a sound she cannot place. A man comes back to the edge of the camp carrying nothing, though he left with a spear, and for a moment everyone studies his face before they study his empty hands. In that pause, before he speaks, there is a tension more important than hunger, and almost as old as fear. It is the tension between what happened and what can be said about what happened. Civilization does not exist yet. There are no walls, no tax records, no kings, no courts, no contracts pressed into clay. But the fragile condition that will one day make all of those things possible is already here, flickering in the firelight. Human beings are beginning to live not only in the physical world, but in the shared world inside one another's minds. That invisible world is easy to miss when looking backward across such a great distance. Stone tools survive, hearths survive, bones survive, pollen survives in lake beds and caves, cut marks on animal remains, traces of ochre, fragments of shell ornaments, the black signatures of ancient fires. These remain, but trust does not fossilize. Suspicion leaves no clean imprint in sediment. A promise made beside a riverbank disappears without a trace. So does its betrayal. And yet what survives in the record suggests that long before cities rise, long before writing turns speech into a durable instrument, human life is already resting on delicate acts of mutual dependence that are impossible without some working expectation of honesty. Someone says there is water beyond the ridge. Someone claims to have seen hoof tracks in the valley. Someone signals that danger is near. Someone swears a wound is healing. In small bands, under relentless pressure from weather, predators, disease, injury, and scarcity. Truth is not an abstract virtue. It is often the shortest path between survival and death. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. If this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy, the first lie in human history is not preserved for us in any direct way. No archaeologist will brush dirt from a stone and find engraved on it the sentence that's changed everything. There is no earliest confession, no first detected fraud, no name attached to the act. Scholars still debate even the conditions under which lying becomes truly possible, because deception exists in more than one form. Animals mislead in simple ways. A bird feigns injury to draw a predator from its nest. An insect resembles a leaf. A primate may conceal intention, bluff dominance, or withhold a warning call. But human deception becomes something stranger and more powerful. It is not just a misleading display. It is the deliberate manipulation of another mind through symbols. To lie in the fully human sense, one must imagine what another person believes, understand that belief can be changed by words or gestures, and then choose to replace reality with something else. That does not merely hide the world, it edits it. To appreciate why that matters, it helps to stand for a while inside the kind of life most humans live for almost all of our species' existence, for tens of thousands of years, and far longer if we include earlier members of the human line. People moved through landscapes that demanded constant collective skill. They tracked animals over long distances. They recognized edible plants in shifting seasons. They remembered water sources, dangerous slopes, sheltering overhangs, migration routes, nesting places, and the moods of weather. They cared for infants who remained dependent for unusually long periods. They watched the old, relied on the experienced, and learned from one another with extraordinary intensity. Humans are not the fastest predators, the strongest fighters, or the best climbers. What made them formidable was cooperation. A lone human on an ancient plain is vulnerable. A group of humans that shares information becomes something entirely different. That sharing does more than transfer knowledge. It builds a social atmosphere. In very small groups, reputation is almost impossible to escape. Everyone notices patterns. Who returns with meat and who comes back empty-handed. Who shares generously and who hides food. Who panics in danger. Who exaggerates. Who calms children. Who can be trusted to keep watch. Anthropologists studying more recent foraging societies, though never exact replicas of deep prehistory, have often noted how intensely face-to-face communities monitor fairness, boasting, generosity, sexual conduct, and obligation. The evidence remains incomplete, and no single modern group can stand in for the ancient past. But the comparison suggests something important when people depend on one another every day. Social knowledge becomes a survival technology. One does not need formal institutions to enforce truth when everyone lives inside everyone else's memory. And yet that very intimacy creates the first opening for deception. The closer the group, the more valuable belief becomes. If others think you are brave, they may follow you. If they think you are injured, they may feed you. If they think you saw game in the east, they may walk east. If they believe your child is also their responsibility, your lineage gains support. If they trust that you distributed meat fairly when no one was watching, your standing remains intact. The earliest lie, whenever it came, likely appeared not in a courtroom or palace but in a human circle small enough for every face to matter. Its scale may have been tiny. Its consequence, at first, may have been modest. But the principle inside it was immense. A person discovered that another person's behavior could be guided not only by force or example, but by a false picture of reality. This possibility may sound inevitable to us, because we are surrounded by deception in forms so ordinary we barely notice them. But in evolutionary terms, it is a dangerous innovation. The social world of humans works only if information is trustworthy most of the time. If every warning is doubted, every claim checked, every memory contested, cooperation becomes slow, expensive, and unstable. A hunting party cannot function if each signal requires verification. Childcare breaks down if no one believes a mother's alarm. Food sharing weakens if every report of need is suspected as performance. So there is a built-in tension from the beginning. Human groups gain immense power from communication, but that same communication opens the door to manipulation. The species becomes stronger and more vulnerable at once. That double condition may be one of the deepest features of human history. Our ancestors did not merely evolve bigger brains, they evolved a new exposure to unreality. Once minds can represent the world in shared symbols. They can also represent worlds that are absent, hypothetical, remembered, desired, feared, or invented. This is one of the great thresholds in the human story. It makes planning possible. It makes teaching possible. It makes ritual possible. It makes myth possible. It also makes lying possible. The same mental architecture that allows one person to warn the group about a predator unseen beyond the hill also allows one person to claim a predator is there when it is not. There is no clean dividing wall between the powers that build culture and the powers that distort it. Long before agriculture, people are already inhabiting moral terrain as well as physical terrain. One can glimpse this in the archaeological hints of care and continuity. Burials suggest memory. Personal ornaments suggest signalling an identity. Repeated use of particular places suggests collective meaning attached to landscape. Ochre, carving, and later cave imagery suggest that humans are not merely reacting to the world but interpreting it together. Such acts imply shared attention, and shared attention always brings the question of sincerity with it. When a mark means something, someone can misuse meaning. When an object signals status, someone can counterfeit status. When a gesture invites trust, someone can exploit trust. The first lie, therefore, does not appear out of nowhere. It emerges inside a species that has already become highly dependent on symbols, relationships, and cooperative fictions about who belongs to whom. Even the structure of human childhood points toward this future. Human children are unusually social readers. They watch eyes, tone, posture, and intention. They learn from demonstration with astonishing sensitivity. They do not merely absorb movements, they infer purpose. This makes cultural transmission extraordinarily rich, but it also means children are born into a world where they must learn whom to trust. Adults, in turn, become experts at managing impressions. They soothe, redirect, conceal, dramatize danger, soften grief, perform confidence, suppress panic. Not all of this is lying. Much of it is social regulation, but it shows how early human life depends on the management of other minds. The road to deception is not separate from caregiving, teaching, leadership, and persuasion. It runs beside them. There is another reason the first lie matters, and it reaches beyond the campfire into the whole later history of civilization. Human groups are not held together only by direct observation. Even in small communities, much must be accepted on trust. No one sees everything. No one knows all motives. No one can follow every hunter, witness every exchange, or verify every claim about the distant ridge, the hidden cache, the sickness, the storm, or the stranger seen near the water. This means every group lives partly on credit. Belief is extended in advance of proof. Once that becomes normal, the social world acquires both flexibility and risk. It can coordinate action across distance and uncertainty, but it also becomes vulnerable to those who can steer belief for personal advantage. Some scholars would argue that deception must have deep roots in primate social life, and that humans simply refine an older strategy. Others place the decisive threshold later, with language sophisticated enough to communicate not just immediate cues but counterfactual stories. The truth may involve both. Biological deception is ancient, fully human lying, the kind that can spread through memory and reshape cooperation, likely requires more than instinctive bluffing. It requires a mind that can hold truth and falsehood side by side and choose between them strategically. That is a rare and unsettling power. It means that the human social world is never purely natural in the simple sense. It is always mediated by representation, by what people say is happening, what others believe is happening, and what both sides suspect beneath the surface. Imagine again that figure returning to the firelight with empty hands. Perhaps the hunt failed. Perhaps he lost the spear. Perhaps he kept something back. Perhaps he saw danger and fled. Perhaps he found food and hid it for later. Perhaps he wants to protect his status and so invents a story. We do not know. We cannot know. But that moment, repeated in endless variations across thousands of generations, may matter more than the invention of many later tools. Because in that moment, a human group confronts an invisible frontier. Stone can be shaped, fire can be carried, but now reality itself can be revised in speech. The earliest communities do not need philosophy to feel the consequences. They only need experience. Some people prove reliable, others do not. Trust gathers slowly and breaks quickly. A false alarm wastes energy. A false claim about food redirects the group. A false accusation poisons alliances. A false promise leaves someone exposed. Reputation becomes memory's answer to uncertainty. If the liar gains once, the group learns. If the group never learns, the liar gains more. Here, at the level of a few families beneath open sky, we can already see the outline of a future that will one day include forged treaties, sacred frauds, invented dynasties, false accounts, political myths, imperial propaganda, and entire civilizations organized around managed belief. But all of that is still far away. For now there is only the small, dangerous miracle that one mind can plant a false world inside another. That is where the story begins, not with empires or scripture or law, but with dependence. The first lie matters because truth had already become useful. Humans had crossed into a mode of life where what one person knows can save many, where memory can outlast danger, where language can turn separate bodies into a coordinated group. In such a world, deception is not a side effect. It is a structural possibility built into the same machinery that makes us human. The old landscape remains vast and indifferent, full of cold, hunger, teeth, distance, and dark. But a second landscape is forming inside the species, made of trust, expectation, and imagined realities. Civilization will one day be built there first. At first, the lie is probably too small to deserve the grand weight later ages will place upon it. It does not arrive wearing a crown. It does not descend from a temple stair or spread across a kingdom in the mouth of an official messenger. It begins at the scale of appetite, a hidden scrap of food, a denied mistake, a claimed sighting no one else can confirm, an injury exaggerated, a fear concealed, a desire disguised. The earliest useful deception is not ideological, it is immediate. It belongs to bodies under pressure and to minds learning, perhaps for the first time, that survival can be negotiated not only with stone, muscle, and endurance, but with appearance. Somewhere in the deep past, probably many times over, someone realizes that reality is not the only thing that moves a group. Belief moves it too. That realization would not have appeared in a vacuum. Ancient human life is full of asymmetries in knowledge. One person sees what another does not. One hears movement in the dark. One finds a cache of roots. One notices a wound before it festers. One reaches the water source first. In small foraging groups, such moments are constant. Information is rarely distributed equally. This matters because deception thrives in the gap between private knowledge and public trust. If everyone sees the same thing, lying has little room to breathe. If one person knows more than the others, even for a moment, the social field changes. A choice becomes possible. Tell the truth, with whatever consequence truth brings, or shape the story and let the group act on the shaped version instead. The uses of such deception are easy to imagine even if the evidence can never name a first case. Food is the simplest example. Hunger has always been among the strongest forces acting on human behavior. In lean seasons or after failed hunts, the line between a tolerable day and a desperate one can narrow dangerously. Under such conditions, concealment becomes tempting. A successful gatherer may keep part of a find hidden. A hunter may underreport what was found elsewhere. Someone may claim to have eaten less than they did, or to be weaker than they are, in order to draw more sympathy and more shares from the group. Among highly cooperative people, generosity is expected, but that only sharpens the payoff for strategic dishonesty. The more the group values fairness, the more one can gain by appearing fair while quietly escaping its cost. Yet the first useful lie may not concern food at all. It may concern fear. Fear is socially contagious and therefore socially manageable. To admit terror may lower status. To conceal terror may preserve it. In dangerous environments, confidence itself has value. A person who panics can unravel collective action. A person who projects certainty can steady others, even when that certainty is partly false. Here deception begins to blur with leadership. Someone claims to know the safest route when they do not. Someone signals calm during a threat they barely understand. Someone insists an animal is farther away than it really is. Some of these acts may be compassionate, even necessary. Others may be self-protective. No single explanation fully accounts for this early terrain, because deception is not born morally sorted. It appears in mixed form, tangled with courage, vanity, care, and self-interest. Sexual and reproductive competition also provide fertile ground for early lies. Long before formal marriage systems or inheritance rules, access to mates, reputation for strength, and perceived reliability would have mattered. A person might exaggerate skill, downplay weakness, conceal prior behavior, or imply alliances they do not truly possess. In species with heavy parental investment and long child dependency, these judgments are not trivial. They shape survival prospects for offspring as well as adults. Human beings are unusual not only because they mate, but because they form social expectations around mating, kin support, and child rearing. That means desire becomes public in some degree, and public things invite manipulation. The earliest lie may have lived in courtship as easily as in hunger, a false display of competence, a concealed rivalry, a denied promise, a claim of exclusivity or protection that reality could not support. Anthropologists and evolutionary psychologists sometimes point to deception as an unavoidable product of social intelligence itself. Once individuals compete within cooperative groups, selection may favor not just the ability to cooperate, but the ability to exploit cooperation selectively. This idea remains debated, and scholars disagree over how far such models can be projected into specific prehistoric contexts. But the broad pattern is persuasive. Humans are not simply altruistic creatures or simply selfish ones. They are strategic social beings living in networks where reputation matters. Direct force is costly, and information can be used as leverage. In that setting, the first lie is useful precisely because it is parasitic on a generally truthful environment. It works only because other people usually believe what they are told. This is one reason the earliest deceptions are likely small, infrequent, and highly situational. A world saturated with lies collapses too quickly for lying to remain advantageous. If no one believes anyone, speech loses much of its coordinating power. The liar needs a functioning background of trust. In that sense, Deception begins as theft from the common social good. It draws value from the very honesty it erodes. The hidden logic is ancient and severe the more reliable the community, the more profitable a single believable falsehood becomes. That may be why lying, once it appears, never disappears. It is too adaptive at the margins, too efficient in moments where immediate gain outweighs long-term cost, too tightly woven into the cognitive powers that also support empathy, planning, teaching, and social belonging. There is a quieter possibility too, one less dramatic but perhaps just as important. The first useful deception may not be directed outward in an obviously predatory way. It may begin as self-protection against punishment, shame, or exclusion. Someone breaks a tool and blames chance. Someone fails in a task and claims interference. Someone denies having taken more than their share. In small communities, where memory is sharp and repeated contact is unavoidable, the costs of visible failure can be high. Shame is not a modern invention, nor is face-saving. A person does not need to be malicious to lie. They need only to fear what truth will do to their standing. This matters because it suggests deception enters human life not only through aggression, but through vulnerability. The liar is not always the strong exploiting the weak. Sometimes the liar is simply the exposed person trying to remain inside the group. That fact would shape the moral atmosphere of the earlier societies. Deception is harder to eradicate when it springs from needs everyone recognizes: hunger, fear, desire, embarrassment, jealousy, ambition, panic, grief, self-preservation. These are not deviant states. They are normal human conditions. What changes is the new ability to root them through symbols. A frightened animal flees. A frightened human can flee and later invent a reason. A jealous primate may posture or strike. A jealous human can recast events, alter memory in speech, and persuade others to see a rival differently. This is a threshold far more consequential than it first appears. It means conflict is no longer limited to direct physical contest. It can now take place inside narratives. Once that happens, the campfire becomes something more than a source of warmth. It becomes a place where realities are negotiated, accounts are compared, interpretations compete, absences are explained, motives are guessed. A person who speaks convincingly acquires a kind of power different from strength or speed. It is still early, still local, still tethered to immediate life, but the principle has arrived. The group does not act only on what is, but on what seems to be. The persuasive individual gains influence not because facts have changed, but because shared perception has. This is the embryo of politics in the oldest possible sense. Not institutions, not offices, but the management of collective interpretation. The surprising detail is that this development may have been partly beneficial. Absolute transparency is not always socially stabilizing. Human groups often rely on tact, omission, emotional softening, and managed impressions to remain cohesive. Even in deep prehistory, one can imagine circumstances where blunt truth wounds unnecessarily or destabilizes a fragile moment. A hunter returns empty-handed not because of cowardice, but because an accident would shame another member of the group if fully told. A parent reassures a child beyond the limits of evidence. An elder projects certainty to prevent panic during a storm. These are not the same as exploitative lies, but they occupy nearby ground. Scholars still debate where deception ends and socially useful narrative begins. The evidence remains incomplete because the motives behind prehistoric speech are lost to us. What survives in the record suggests only that humans became deeply invested in shaping one another's understanding, and not always in straightforward ways. Over time, even a handful of successful deceptions would force groups to adapt. Suspicion sharpens. People look for corroboration. They compare one story against another. They punish obvious liars, mock boasters, test claims, and elevate those whose reliability proves durable. In this way, the first lie does not simply create dishonesty. It also helps create discernment. Trust becomes more selective. Reputation becomes more valuable. Social intelligence grows not just in the ability to mislead, but in the ability to detect misleading. This arms race may be one of the hidden engines of human cognition. A species that can deceive effectively must also become better at reading tone, memory gaps, hesitation, inconsistency, and motive. The face becomes a field of clues. Speech becomes layered. Silence becomes meaningful. Human social life grows denser, more interpretive, more psychologically demanding. It is tempting to imagine a lost age of pure honesty before all this, some pristine human dawn untouched by manipulation. The evidence does not support that vision. Cooperation is ancient, but so is competition within cooperation. Generosity and concealment likely grow together. Shared childcare and mate rivalry likely coexist. Alliance and resentment probably live side by side from very early on. The first useful lie is therefore not a fall from innocence in the later religious sense. It is a feature of a species becoming more mentally complex, more socially entangled, and more capable of converting inner intention into outward strategy. That does not make deception harmless. It makes it structurally human. And once a false statement succeeds, even once, something changes permanently. Not in the world outside, perhaps, but in the available repertoire of action. A technique has been discovered. The person who benefits learns one lesson. The people deceived learn another. Both lessons remain. They can be repeated, refined, passed along in behavior if not in explicit teaching. A child watching adults dispute events may absorb not only moral norms, but tactical possibilities. The group begins to live with a new kind of uncertainty, one not imposed by weather or predators but generated from within. The danger is now internal as well as external, not merely whether the river has flooded or the animal herd has moved, but whether the account being offered is true. This is how something so small begins reshaping civilization long before civilization exists. A hidden mouthful of food, an altered story, a concealed motive, an invented excuse, these do not look like world historical acts, but they reveal a species crossing into a new order of life, one where social reality can be modified deliberately. The first useful deception does not found a state or a religion or a market. Not yet. What it does is more fundamental. It proves that belief itself can be handled, redirected, and exploited. That lesson, once learned, will never be forgotten. Later ages will build institutions around it, but here, in the deep human past, it remains close to the body and the fire. Born from need, sharpened by opportunity, and carried forward by the oldest pressures any human being has ever known to eat, to belong, to mate, to avoid blame, to preserve status, and to survive one more night. There is a moment, difficult to see but impossible to ignore once imagined, when sound becomes more than reaction. Before that threshold, cries, calls, and gestures carry urgency but remain anchored to the immediate world. A warning means danger now. A signal means come here. A display means back away. But at some point in the long evolution of our species, those signals begin to stretch. They detach from the present. They begin to refer not only to what is happening, but to what happened, what might happen, and what could be imagined. That shift is not just a refinement of communication, it is a transformation of reality itself, because it allows humans to share things that are not directly visible, and once that becomes possible, lying becomes something entirely new. Language, in its fully symbolic form, does more than label the world. It creates a shared space where the world can be rearranged. A person can describe an animal that is not there. A person can recall a path that others did not walk. A person can invent a cause for an event that had a different origin. This is not merely error, it is controlled divergence from truth. The capacity depends on what cognitive scientists call theory of mind, the ability to understand that others have beliefs, that those beliefs may differ from reality, and that they can be altered. Without this, deception in the human sense cannot exist. With it, deception becomes not only possible but scalable. What makes this development so consequential is not just the existence of language, but its flexibility. Human language is generative. With a limited set of sounds and structures, it can produce an unlimited number of statements. Some of those statements describe the world accurately, others do not. The system itself does not enforce truth. It allows for it, but it also allows for its opposite. That means every advance in communicative power carries a parallel expansion in the capacity for distortion. The same mind that can guide a group to water through remembered description can guide them away from it through invented detail. The same words that preserve knowledge can reshape it. Archaeological evidence cannot show us the first spoken lie, but it can show us the emergence of behaviors that require advanced symbolic thought. Personal ornaments, carved objects, pigments used in non-utilitarian ways, and eventually complex imagery suggest that humans are representing ideas beyond immediate survival. These traces appear tens of thousands of years ago, and perhaps earlier in more subtle forms. They indicate that people are not only reacting to the environment, but constructing shared meanings. Once meaning exists at that level, the manipulation of meaning becomes an available act. Scholars still debate the exact timeline and pathways of language development, but there is broad agreement that by the time anatomically modern humans spread widely across the planet, they possess the cognitive tools necessary for both storytelling and deception. There is a crucial difference between simple misdirection and symbolic lying. In earlier forms of deception seen in other species, the act is often tied directly to behavior, a display, a posture, a call. It influences perception, but it does not typically create a detailed alternative version of events that can be revisited, discussed, or elaborated. Human language changes that. A lie can now persist beyond the moment. It can be remembered. It can be retold. It can be defended, expanded, and woven into other narratives. It gains a kind of temporal life. This makes it far more powerful and far more dangerous, because it can shape future actions long after the original event has passed. With language also comes the possibility of consistency and contradiction. In a purely immediate world, inconsistency is difficult to track, but once statements can be stored in memory and compared, contradictions emerge. Someone says one thing and later says another. Someone's account does not match what others experienced. This creates the conditions for detecting lies. The development of language therefore produces a dual effect. It enables deception, and it enables the policing of deception. Human groups become arenas where stories are tested against one another. Agreement becomes meaningful. Disagreement becomes evidence. The social world becomes interpretive. requiring not just observation, but judgment. This interpretive world is also shaped by the emergence of shared narratives. Humans do not simply exchange isolated facts. They build stories that link events together. These stories help organize memory, assign causality, and create a sense of coherence. They explain why something happened, not just that it happened. This is essential for learning and planning, but it also opens another pathway for distortion. A lie does not need to be a direct false statement. It can be a rearrangement of emphasis, a selective omission, a framing that leads others to draw a certain conclusion. The complexity of narrative makes deception more subtle. It can hide inside truth. One of the less obvious consequences of language is that it allows for internal rehearsal. Humans can think in words, not just speak them. This means a lie can be constructed privately before it is delivered. It can be refined, adjusted, and timed. This separates human deception from immediate reaction. It becomes strategic. A person can anticipate how others will respond, predict objections, and prepare answers. This level of planning suggests that lying is not merely an impulse, but a considered act, at least in some cases. The ability to simulate conversations in the mind gives the liar an advantage, but it also raises the stakes, because the lie must now survive multiple layers of scrutiny. There is also an emotional dimension to this shift. Language allows humans to communicate not only facts, but feelings, intentions, and commitments. Trust becomes more than a pattern of behavior. It becomes something that can be expressed and reinforced through words. Promises can be made. Assurances can be given. This deepens social bonds, but it also creates new forms of vulnerability. A broken promise is not just a failed action. It is a contradiction between words and reality. The pain of betrayal is partly linguistic. It arises from the gap between what was said and what occurred. This emotional weight may help explain why lying carries moral significance in human societies, even in their earliest forms. The emergence of language likely also changes how memory works within groups. Information can be transmitted more precisely and more widely. Knowledge accumulates. Skills are taught in detail, but memory is not perfect, and language can reshape it. Each retelling of an event may alter it slightly. Over time, the boundary between accurate recall and reconstructed narrative can blur. This creates a space where lies can blend with genuine memory. A person may come to believe their own altered account. This complicates the distinction between intentional deception and self-deception. Scholars still debate how often early humans might have crossed this boundary, but it is clear that once language interacts with memory, the reliability of both becomes more complex. In growing groups, language allows information to travel beyond direct observation. A person can report on events they witnessed elsewhere. Others must decide whether to trust that report. This extends the reach of both truth and deception. A lie can now influence individuals who were not present at the original event. It can spread through the group, shaping behavior at a distance. This is the beginning of scalable influence. It does not require writing or formal institutions. It requires only a network of speakers and listeners. The larger and more connected the group becomes, the more powerful this mechanism grows. There is an important tension here that remains unresolved throughout human history. Language is the foundation of cooperation at scale. It allows for coordination across time and space. It enables planning, teaching, and the transmission of culture. Without it, complex societies would not exist. But language also introduces ambiguity and the possibility of manipulation. Every statement must be interpreted. Tone, context, intention, and prior knowledge all influence meaning. This makes communication rich, but also uncertain. The same sentence can be understood in different ways. This ambiguity can be used deliberately. A speaker can exploit it to mislead without making an outright false claim. The line between truth and lie becomes less clear. As language develops, so do social norms around its use. Groups begin to establish expectations about honesty, reliability, and accountability. These norms are not written down, but they are enforced through approval, disapproval, inclusion, and exclusion. A person known to lie may be ignored or punished. A person known to speak accurately may be trusted and followed. Reputation becomes tied not only to actions, but to words. This creates incentives for honesty, but also for more sophisticated forms of deception that are harder to detect. The arms race continues, now at a higher level of complexity. One of the most profound consequences of language is that it allows humans to create shared realities that do not exist in the physical world. Concepts like kinship beyond immediate family, group identity, territorial boundaries, and later, much more abstract ideas, are all constructed and maintained through communication. These are not lies in themselves. They are collective agreements, but they demonstrate the power of shared belief. If enough people accept a concept, it becomes functionally real in guiding behavior. This raises a difficult question that scholars continue to explore. At what point does a useful fiction become indistinguishable from a lie? And when does it become something else entirely, like a social institution? In the deep past, these questions are not articulated, but their effects are felt. A group that can coordinate through shared stories has an advantage. A group that can maintain trust while allowing some flexibility in interpretation may be more resilient. But a group that loses its ability to distinguish reliable information from misleading information becomes vulnerable. The balance is delicate. Language amplifies both sides of this equation. It strengthens cooperation and introduces new forms of risk. By the time humans are fully dependent on language, the first lie is no longer an isolated act. It is part of a system. It interacts with memory, reputation, emotion, and social structure. It can be simple or complex, impulsive or planned, harmful or, in some cases, temporarily stabilizing. But it is always operating within the same underlying framework, a shared symbolic world, where reality is mediated by communication. That framework is the true turning point. Once it exists, the trajectory toward larger and more organized forms of deception becomes possible. What survives in the record suggests that this transformation is gradual, uneven, and difficult to trace in detail. There is no single moment when language appears fully formed, and no single moment when lying becomes common. But the direction is clear. As human communication becomes more abstract, more flexible, and more central to survival, the capacity to distort that communication grows alongside it. The first lie, whatever its specific form, is no longer just a trick of the moment. It is now a function of the human condition, and from this point forward, every advance in how humans speak to one another will carry this dual legacy: the power to share truth more effectively and the power to reshape it. Once language becomes rich enough to carry falsehood, trust stops being a simple instinct and becomes infrastructure. It is no longer just a feeling between familiar individuals. It is the invisible system through which food moves, warning spreads, children survive, injuries are managed, mates are chosen, and disputes are contained before they break the group apart. In the ancient world, long before roads and walls and accounting tablets, there is already a network more essential than any later monument. It exists in expectation. When one person speaks, others act as though the words refer, however imperfectly, to something real. That assumption is fragile, but without it the human way of life begins to fail. This is easy to underestimate because trust leaves so little behind. Archaeology can show a shared hearth, repeated occupation of a shelter, butchered bones carried back to camp, tools made with materials transported from elsewhere, even signs that injured individuals lived long enough to receive sustained care. These clues imply cooperation over time. They imply that people do not simply live near one another, but rely on one another in ways that exceed momentary convenience. A broken leg that heals suggests others brought food. An elderly body that survived heavy tooth loss suggests someone processed food or shared softer portions. A child does not make it through the long human dependency period on one adult alone. Behind all of this stands a social wager that other people will do roughly what they claim, remember obligations, and respond to need without exploiting every opening for personal gain. The earliest human communities are small, but that does not make them simple. In some ways, it makes them more demanding. There are no anonymous systems to absorb failure. If one person withholds useful information, the consequences can be immediate. If a hunter exaggerates the safety of a route, others may be exposed. If someone conceals signs of illness, a whole group may suffer. If a caregiver lies about where a child is or what a child needs, the costs are severe. In such settings, trust is not decorative, it is load-bearing. The camp continues because people believe that shared reality, though never perfect, is reliable enough to act on. This is where the human story becomes especially interesting, because trust does not emerge despite vulnerability. It emerges through vulnerability. A human infant is born unfinished in a way few other mammals can match. Years pass before the child can gather food, avoid danger, regulate emotion, or understand social rules with any stability. This prolonged dependence is often described as a burden, but it is also one of the great engines of human culture. Children learn slowly because there is so much to learn. They absorb not just technique, but norms, expectations, and the subtle cues of group life. That learning depends on trust at nearly every level. A child believes the warning call, the soothing gesture, the indication of who belongs and who does not. Adults, in turn, depend on one another to help sustain that child through years of exposure and fragility. Cooperative breeding, as some anthropologists describe it, is not merely shared babysitting. It is a social system built on mutual confidence that care will circulate. The same is true of knowledge itself. Early humans survive not because each person discovers the world from scratch, but because information accumulates and is passed along. Which plants are edible after processing? Which tracks belong to dangerous animals? Which season brings fish upstream? Which cliff edge is unstable after rain? Which stranger can be approached and which should be avoided? None of this can be verified from first principles every time. Learning would be too slow, and the price of error too high. Much of human life therefore rests on testimony. One person knows because another knew before them. Trust becomes the bridge by which memory crosses generations. This may be one of the strongest reasons deception becomes historically consequential. A lie is not only a false statement in the moment, it is a corruption of cultural transmission. What makes this more remarkable is that human groups continue functioning anyway. They do not dissolve under the pressure of uncertainty. They build norms around it. Even in small communities, there are likely informal tests for sincerity and reliability. Repetition matters. Witnesses matter. Who says it matters? The person known to boast is heard differently from the person known to observe carefully. The person who shares food consistently carries a different weight from the one who hides it. Trust, then, is not evenly distributed. It is calibrated. It attaches to bodies, voices, and histories. This calibration is one of humanity's earliest political systems, though it would be too formal to call it that yet. It is a way of allocating belief. That allocation shapes power long before power has titles. A reliable speaker can guide movement, settle tensions, attract support, and frame events. An unreliable one may be mocked, doubted, or ignored. This means trust is not just morally valuable, it is socially convertible. It can become influence. A person trusted during danger may later be trusted in matters of food or conflict. Someone whose judgment proves sound may become the one others glance toward before deciding. None of this requires hierarchy in the later state sense. It requires only repeated situations where collective action depends on shared interpretation. The human group begins to develop gradients of authority out of differential credibility. At the same time, trust is never absolute. It cannot be. Ancient life provides too many incentives to manage appearances, conceal failures, and defend status. So the system that emerges is not one of pure belief, but of belief mixed with vigilance. This is likely why gossip, though often dismissed as trivial, may have deep evolutionary roots. In small communities, talk about absent others is a way of updating the map of trust. Who took more than their share? Who failed in courage? Who was generous? Who misled? Gossip can be cruel, but it is also informational. It helps communities distribute confidence and suspicion. Scholars still debate how central gossip was in early human social evolution, but the broader point stands: trust needs maintenance. It does not sustain itself automatically. This maintenance has emotional costs. To trust is to risk being wrong. To distrust too much is to weaken cooperation. Human beings must therefore live in a tense middle ground. They extend belief often enough for the group to function, while remaining alert enough to avoid repeated exploitation. That balance may explain why humans are so attentive to nuance in expression. Tone, pause, eye movement, posture, timing, and confidence all become data. The face is read not just for emotion, but for congruence. Does the story fit the body telling it? Does the explanation arrive too quickly? Does the denial come before the accusation is fully made? These are not modern habits. They're likely very old, because once trust becomes infrastructure, the detection of strain within it becomes a survival skill. There is another dimension to this that reaches forward into civilization. Trust allows groups to act collectively in situations no single individual can verify in full. If a scout reports animals in the valley, others may move. If someone warns of danger downstream, camp may shift. If a knowledgeable elder identifies a season of scarcity, food use may change. In each case, the group behaves on information distributed unevenly. This is the first hint of scale. Human beings are beginning to coordinate action beyond direct common observation. That capacity will one day support armies, trade routes, tax systems, priesthoods, and states. But its root is much older and much humbler. It begins when a handful of people under open sky decide that another person's account is good enough to organize around. This is why the lie is never merely personal. Even the smallest deception presses against a structure larger than itself. To lie about food is to interfere with distribution. To lie about danger is to interfere with collective movement. To lie about another person is to interfere with alliance and care. Every falsehood tests the tensile strength of the social fabric. If the fabric holds, the liar may gain. If it tears, everyone pays. This makes early communities both resilient and brittle. Resilient because close observation, memory, and repeated interaction often expose patterns quickly. Brittle because there is so little slack in the system. A single falsehood at the wrong time, under the wrong conditions, can matter enormously. One of the lesser-known insights from studies of cooperation is that groups often survive not because individuals are perfectly honest, but because communities develop ways to contain dishonesty before it becomes endemic. Punishment, ridicule, exclusion, reduced status, withheld support, and close monitoring all help preserve enough honesty for the group to function. What survives in the record suggests that prehistoric humans were capable of sustained coordination over long periods and wide distances, which strongly implies they were also capable of defending trust against constant erosion. Otherwise, the species would never have achieved the cultural complexity already visible deep in the Paleolithic. The very existence of long-term cooperation is indirect evidence that lying was constrained, even if never eliminated. But every successful constraint has a shadow. As communities become better at detecting obvious deception, deception itself becomes subtler. The liar learns to align the story with expectations, to borrow details that sound right, to anchor invention in partial truth. This is a profound turning point. The social world is no longer divided between truth and visible falsehood. It becomes layered. Honest signals mix with calculated ones. Genuine emotion can be performed. Real generosity can conceal strategic motives. The infrastructure of trust remains standing, but now traffic moves through it in more complicated ways. Civilization, in one sense, is already foreshadowed here. Its later institutions will not create this complexity. They will inherit it. The oldest human groups therefore live inside a paradox. The more cooperative they become, the more indispensable trust grows. The more indispensable trust grows, the more valuable deception becomes for anyone willing to exploit it. Yet if deception spreads too far, the cooperation that made it profitable collapses. So human societies are forced, from an astonishingly early point, into a delicate equilibrium between openness and suspicion, confidence and testing, shared belief and guarded interpretation. That equilibrium may be one of the deepest constants in history. It can be seen in everything from family life to imperial administration, from marketplaces to religious ritual, from whispered accusations to official proclamations. But in the beginning it is still intimate, still local, still measured in food portions, warnings, promises, and remembered behavior. Trust, then, is not a soft virtue draped over human life after the harder work of survival is done. It is the harder work. It is the unseen architecture that lets separate human bodies function as something like a single adaptive unit. It allows memory to travel, labor to coordinate, care to persist, and danger to be anticipated before it arrives. The first lie matters because it reveals that this architecture, however ancient, is vulnerable from within. Stone can break from pressure. Trust can break from speech. And once human beings discover that words can weaken or redirect the very system that keeps them alive, the future begins to take on a different shape. Not yet the shape of kingdoms or laws, but something already moving in that direction, a world in which belief itself becomes one of the primary materials from which human life is built. At some point, the lie stops belonging only to the moment and begins to travel. It leaves the tight circle of immediate need and starts to move through relationships, across time, and between people who were not present when it was first spoken. This is a quiet but decisive shift. A deception no longer has to succeed face to face. It can be carried, repeated, reshaped, and believed at a distance. What was once a small adjustment to reality becomes something that can influence entire patterns of interaction. The campfire is still there, but the boundaries of its influence begin to stretch. This change is closely tied to the slow enlargement of human groups. For most of deep history, communities remain relatively small, but they are not isolated. Bands meet, exchange partners, share information, compete, cooperate, and move across overlapping territories. Networks form, even if loosely. A person can now be known not only through direct interaction, but through reputation carried by others. And reputation, unlike immediate observation, is built almost entirely out of speech. This creates a new environment for deception. A lie no longer needs to withstand the scrutiny of those who saw the event. It needs only to sound plausible to those who did not. In such a world, status becomes increasingly negotiable through narrative. A person can claim skill beyond what others have witnessed. They can present themselves as brave, generous, knowledgeable, or connected in ways that are difficult to verify. If believed, these claims can shift how others treat them. Access to resources, mating opportunities, and influence can all be affected. The earliest forms of social hierarchy may not arise solely from physical dominance or age, but from perceived competence and trustworthiness, both of which can be shaped through communication. The lie, in this context, becomes a tool not just for immediate gain, but for repositioning oneself within the social landscape. There is evidence, indirect but compelling, that humans become increasingly sensitive to such positioning. Personal ornaments, for example, appear in the archaeological record long before cities or writing. Beads, shells, pigments, and carved objects are worn or displayed in ways that signal identity, group affiliation, or status. These items do not speak, but they communicate. They are part of a broader system in which appearance carries meaning. And where appearance carries meaning, there is always the possibility of manipulation. An ornament can signal belonging even if the claim is weak. A display can exaggerate importance. A crafted image can suggest a story about the person wearing it. These are not lies in the strict verbal sense, but they operate on the same principle influencing belief without direct evidence. As human groups grow more interconnected, alliances become more complex. Cooperation is no longer limited to immediate kin or close companions. It can extend to neighboring groups, temporary partners, and individuals whose past behavior is known only through report. In such situations, trust must stretch further than direct experience. This creates both opportunity and risk. A well-placed lie can now affect not just one group, but relations between groups. A claim about another band's intentions, a misrepresentation of a past conflict, or an exaggerated account of strength can alter decisions about cooperation or confrontation. The consequences expand. At the same time, deception becomes harder to contain. In a small, tightly knit group, inconsistencies are often quickly noticed. But in a networked environment, information can fragment. Different people hear different versions of events. Contradictions may not meet. A lie can survive longer simply because it is not tested against all available knowledge. This is a new condition. It allows for the persistence of alternative realities within the same broader community. Scholars still debate how early and how extensively such dynamics appeared, but the underlying logic is clear as social networks widen. The control over shared truth becomes more difficult. This widening also changes how memory functions at the group level. Stories begin to circulate beyond their original context. They are retold, sometimes with small alterations, sometimes with larger ones. Over time, the boundary between accurate report and embellished narrative can blur. A lie introduced at one point may be reinforced unintentionally as others repeat it, believing it to be true. In this way, deception can become embedded in collective memory. It is no longer just a tactic used by an individual. It becomes part of what the group thinks it knows. There is an important distinction here between intentional lying and the broader drift of information. Not every falsehood is deliberate. Memory is imperfect. Communication introduces noise. Stories change as they move. But once intentional deception enters this system, it can take advantage of these natural distortions. A lie that aligns with expectations or desires may spread more easily. People are more likely to repeat information that fits what they already believe or hope to be true. This tendency, present even in early human societies, gives deception a kind of momentum. It can travel further than the original speaker ever could. As lies begin to move through networks, they also begin to shape group boundaries. Shared beliefs help define who belongs. If a group accepts a certain narrative about its origins, its enemies, or its practices, that narrative becomes part of its identity. A lie, if widely accepted, can therefore contribute to the formation of group cohesion. This is a subtle and unsettling possibility. It suggests that not all collective identities are built entirely on accurate representations of the past. Some may include elements that are distorted, exaggerated, or invented, yet once established, these elements can be deeply influential, guiding behavior and reinforcing unity. The management of such narratives may give rise to new kinds of social roles. Individuals who are particularly skilled at speaking, remembering, or persuading may gain importance. They may become the ones who recount events, interpret signs, or explain relationships. Their words carry weight, not because they hold formal authority, but because others listen. In this way, the control of narrative begins to emerge as a form of power. It is still informal, still dependent on personal credibility, but it is distinct from physical strength or material control. It operates through belief. This development also introduces a new kind of conflict. Disputes are no longer limited to physical confrontation or direct competition over resources. They can take place in the realm of interpretation. Two people may offer different accounts of the same event. Two groups may remember a shared interaction differently. Resolving such disputes requires more than force. It requires agreement on which version of reality will guide future action. This is not easy, especially when the stakes are high. The potential for deception complicates the process, because it introduces doubt about the sincerity of each account. What survives in the record suggests that early humans were capable of managing such conflicts without constant breakdown. This implies the existence of mechanisms, however informal, for evaluating claims. Repetition, corroboration, consistency with known patterns, and the speaker's reputation all likely play a role. But these mechanisms are not perfect. They reduce uncertainty without eliminating it. A well-crafted lie can still pass through, and when it does, it can alter decisions in ways that ripple outward. There is also a cumulative effect to consider. Each successful deception adds to the repertoire of what is possible. Others observe, learn, and adapt. The techniques of lying become more refined. They may never be formally taught, but they are absorbed through experience. Over generations, this can lead to a more sophisticated understanding of how belief can be shaped. At the same time, Detection strategies also improve. The social environment becomes an ongoing negotiation between these two forces. It is tempting to think of this as a gradual corruption of an originally stable system, but the reality is likely more complex. The expansion of social networks brings enormous benefits. It allows for greater exchange of knowledge, more diverse cooperation, and increased resilience. It supports the spread of innovations and the formation of larger, more flexible communities. Deception is not the cause of this expansion. It is a consequence of it. As humans become more connected, the opportunities for both cooperation and manipulation grow together. This dual growth sets the stage for the next major transformation. Once deception can move through networks and shape relationships at a distance, it becomes possible for it to be used deliberately to organize larger groups. It can justify actions, align interests, and create shared understandings that extend beyond immediate experience. The lie, which began as a small, situational tactic, now has the potential to become structural. It can be woven into the very fabric of how groups define themselves and coordinate their actions. At this point, the human world is no longer just a collection of individuals responding to their environment. It is a web of meanings, expectations, and narratives that guide behavior. Trust still holds it together, but trust is now mediated by stories that travel and change. The first lie has left the campfire. It has entered the wider landscape of human connection, and in doing so, it has begun to reshape not just individual interactions, but the emerging patterns of social life that will, in time, give rise to something far larger than any early group could have imagined. The moment belief becomes steerable, power begins to change its shape. Until then, influence rests mostly in what can be seen directly: strength, endurance, age, memory, hunting skill, fertility, courage under pressure, or access to valuable knowledge about land and season. These forms of authority are real, but they are limited. They must be performed repeatedly. They weaken with injury, age, or failure. A strong person can dominate only so much space. A skilled hunter commands respect only as long as the hunt remains visible in memory. But once human beings learn that stories can organize conduct, another possibility opens. A person no longer needs to be the strongest in every moment if others can be persuaded that their position is natural, necessary, protected, or somehow woven into the order of things. This is one of the most consequential discoveries in the whole history of civilization. Force compels bodies. Belief recruits minds. At first, this likely appears in modest forms. A persuasive elder frames an event in a way that preserves their standing. A charismatic organizer presents a disputed choice as obvious and inevitable. A skilled ritual figure claims special access to hidden causes or unseen patterns. None of this yet amounts to kingship or statecraft, but the principle is already there. When interpretation itself becomes a source of authority, leadership is no longer measured only in action. It is measured in the power to define what action means. The person who names the danger identifies the cause of misfortune, or explains why one course must be taken over another begins to occupy a higher position than someone who merely acts within events. This is the early grammar of power through narrative. That grammar matters because human beings rarely submit for long to naked coercion alone, especially in small-scale societies where departure, resistance, ridicule, or alliance shifting remain possible. To stabilize influence, authority must often appear justified. It must feel sensible to others, or at least unavoidable. This is where fiction, in the broad sense, becomes useful. Not fiction only as outright falsehood, but as selective framing, embellished origin, symbolic claim, and stories arranged to make unequal arrangements feel legitimate. Scholars still debate how early such dynamics crystallize, and the evidence remains incomplete. But anthropology, archaeology, and comparative history all suggest that emerging authority often travels with narratives that explain why certain people should be heeded more than others. One of the lesser-known but revealing features of early leadership is that it often depends on performance more than permanent office. A leader in one context may not dominate in another. The best tracker is not necessarily the best mediator. The boldest fighter may be a poor organizer of exchange. But if someone can unify these shifting domains through story, by presenting themselves as especially favored, unusually insightful, or uniquely fitted for guidance, they gain a more durable kind of influence. The claim need not be entirely false. It only needs to exceed what direct evidence alone would justify. This is where power learns the value of exaggeration. A reputation can be cultivated beyond the observable. A role can be expanded through repeated assertions until the group begins to act as though the assertion were fact. Ritual likely plays a crucial part here. Once human communities develop ceremonies, repeated symbolic acts, and shared explanations for luck, death, fertility, sickness, weather, or animal movement, those who interpret ritual gain leverage. They stand at the crossing point between uncertainty and reassurance in a dangerous world. That position is inherently powerful. A person who can explain why the hunt failed or why illness struck a child does not merely satisfy curiosity. They reduce the chaos of events, and reduction of chaos is one of the oldest sources of authority. Even when explanations are sincere, the temptation to shape them for social advantage is clear. If hidden causes are knowable only through a particular intermediary, that intermediary becomes difficult to challenge. This does not mean all early ritual specialists are cynical deceivers. Far from it. Many likely believe deeply in what they say and do. The line between conviction and manipulation is often thin even in modern societies, and in the distant past it may be almost impossible to separate. What matters is not always whether the speaker privately doubts the claim, but whether the claim places them above ordinary scrutiny. When a leader or specialist can invoke forces others cannot verify directly, they gain room to maneuver. Failure can be reinterpreted, delay can be justified, privilege can be presented as duty, access can be restricted. A narrative shield forms around authority, and narrative shields are often stronger than physical ones. Another important shift happens when groups become large enough that not everyone can observe the behavior of influential individuals firsthand. In very small bands, reputation is tied tightly to visible conduct. But as communities grow, roles differentiate, and networks widen. Personal observation gives way to mediated belief. This creates fertile ground for power. A person may be obeyed not because all know them directly, but because enough others repeat the same account of their importance. Authority begins to float on collective recognition rather than immediate proof. That recognition can be cultivated, it can be staged, it can be inherited, and once that happens, the fiction surrounding power becomes increasingly valuable, because it carries authority farther than the body can travel. Consider how simple the core mechanism is. If people believe one person has special wisdom, they listen more closely, because they listen more closely. That person's words shape decisions more often. Because their words shape decisions more often, outcomes become associated with them, whether deserved or not. Success reinforces belief. Deference becomes habit. Soon the original claim no longer needs constant demonstration. the social world itself begins reproducing it. This is how authority hardens. Not all of it rests on lies, but much of it rests on narratives that are larger, cleaner, and more coherent than reality usually is. The untidy accidents of daily competence are reorganized into the image of natural leadership. The same dynamic can attach to lineage. Once people begin remembering descent lines with greater care, whether for mating rules, alliance, inheritance, ritual position, or territorial claims, ancestry becomes politically useful. A person connected to a respected line gains reflected legitimacy. But ancestry is particularly vulnerable to invention because it depends on memory and narration. A grandfather can be made grander in retelling. A line can be stretched, purified, or selectively edited. Kinship can be emphasized or downplayed depending on advantage. No single explanation fully accounts for how early these practices become systematic. Yet what survives in later historical records suggests that genealogical enhancement is among the most enduring tools of power. Long before kings inscribed divine descent on monuments, ordinary human groups are likely already discovering that bloodlines can be narrated into influence. There is a deeper reason fiction serves power so well. Raw domination is expensive. It requires constant enforcement. Narrative legitimacy is cheaper. If people internalize the explanation for why they should obey, share, follow, defer, or sacrifice, much less overt coercion is needed. This is true in chiefdoms, kingdoms, bureaucracies, and empires, but its roots may extend far earlier. An emerging leader who convinces others that their judgments are especially necessary does not need to win every dispute physically. A ritual specialist who persuades the group that certain offerings must pass through their hands does not need to seize those offerings by force. The story does part of the work. This is also where moral language may begin to attach itself to authority in more formal ways. Certain people present themselves not merely as effective, but as proper. Their role is framed as beneficial to the group, aligned with tradition, demanded by ancestors, or required by forces beyond human preference. Once power wears this moral clothing, opposition becomes harder. To resist the leader is no longer just to resist a person. It may be cast as resisting order, memory, protection, or the invisible structure holding the group together. That move is extraordinarily old, and it is among the most powerful uses of fiction in human history. It converts hierarchy into necessity. Of course, communities are not passive. They test, resent, negotiate, and sometimes mock those who overreach. Archaeological and ethnographic evidence alike suggest that many small-scale societies contain strong levelling mechanisms, ridicule of boastfulness, sanctions against hoarding, resistance to arbitrary dominance, and expectations of generosity from those who claim influence. This matters. The rise of narrative power is not a smooth triumph. It is a struggle. Authority must learn to cloak itself carefully enough to survive communal suspicion. That is why early fiction attached to power is rarely pure invention from nothing. It borrows from shared values. It speaks the language of care, danger, memory, fertility, fairness, or sacred order. The most effective stories are not alien to the group. They are intimate with its fears and hopes, once learned. However, this technique changes the possibilities of social organization forever. A society no longer needs to be held together solely by repeated face-to-face proof of competence. It can begin to stabilize around offices, roles, and identities that are maintained in part by belief. This does not yet produce the full machinery of civilization, but it prepares the mind for it. People become accustomed to treating certain positions as meaningful beyond the individual occupying them. The healer, the elder, the ritual keeper, the lineage head, the one who remembers, the one who interprets signs. These roles acquire a kind of symbolic surplus. Their importance exceeds what direct observation can confirm on any given day. And that surplus is where future states, priesthoods, courts, and dynasties will eventually live. The palace and temple do not invent it from scratch. They inherit a much older human habit, the habit of turning uncertain stories into stable authority. By the time the first settled societies rise, power will already know that belief can outlast muscle, that ceremony can outlast personal charisma, and that a well-framed claim can move people more efficiently than threat alone. The earliest rulers of history will not discover this principle, they will scale it. So the first lie, or the first cluster of lies useful to authority, does not merely help an individual escape blame or gain an extra share. It teaches something far more durable. It teaches that reality is only one of the forces that govern human life. The other is the accepted version of reality, the one carried in memory, ritual, status, and explanation. Once that accepted version can be shaped deliberately, power acquires a new instrument, one subtler than the spear and often stronger than it. From this point on, every growing human hierarchy will face the same temptation, not only to lead people through the world as it is, but to lead them through a version of the world arranged in its own favour. There comes a point when a story stops feeling like a claim and starts feeling like the ground itself. It is repeated often enough, shared widely enough, and woven deeply enough into daily life that questioning it becomes difficult, even unthinkable. At that point, the distinction between lie, belief, and useful fiction begins to blur. What matters is no longer whether the story began as an accurate description of reality, but whether it functions, whether it holds the group together, explains the unpredictable, and gives shape to a world that would otherwise feel dangerously open and uncertain. This is where the sacred begins to overlap with the invented, and where the first lie takes on a new and far more enduring form. Early humans do not separate the world into neat categories of fact and fiction. They live inside narratives that bind landscape, memory, ancestry, and unseen forces into a single interpretive system. A river is not just water. It may carry meaning, intention, or memory. A storm is not just weather. It may signal imbalance, warning, or consequence. Death is not merely biological cessation. It demands explanation, ritual, and placement within a larger order. These interpretations are not necessarily deceptive. Many arise from sincere attempts to understand a complex world with limited information. But within this interpretive richness lies a powerful opportunity. If meaning itself can be shaped, then behavior can be shaped through meaning. One of the most important transitions in human societies is the emergence of shared myths. Not myths as falsehoods in the modern dismissive sense, but as structured narratives that explain origins, relationships, and obligations, where the group came from, why certain animals are hunted and others avoided, why certain places are revered, why certain roles exist. These stories are repeated across generations, often with remarkable consistency. They stabilize expectations. They reduce uncertainty. They create identity. And crucially, they are rarely testable in the ordinary sense. Their authority does not depend on direct verification. It depends on acceptance. This is where the boundary between lie and institution becomes difficult to draw. A story that may have begun as an interpretation, an exaggeration, or even a strategic claim can, over time, become part of the unquestioned framework of the group. Once embedded, it is no longer experienced as deception. It is experienced as reality. Scholars still debate how often early myths contain deliberate manipulation versus gradual evolution of belief, and the evidence remains incomplete. But what survives in later traditions suggests that human societies are fully capable of building stable systems on narratives that are not strictly grounded in observable fact. The key is not perfect accuracy, it is coherence and shared acceptance. Ritual plays a central role in this process. Repetition transforms narrative into experience. A story told once can be doubted, a story enacted again and again, embodied in movement, sound, and shared attention, becomes something else. It becomes felt. It becomes anchored in memory not just as information, but as participation. Ritual reduces ambiguity by aligning perception. Everyone sees the same sequence, hears the same words, moves in the same rhythm. This synchronization strengthens belief. It also makes deviation more visible. A person who refuses to participate stands out. A person who questions the narrative disrupts the shared frame. In this way, ritual acts as both reinforcement and protection for collective belief. Within these systems, certain individuals gain authority as interpreters of the sacred. They may not claim to invent the stories, but they claim to understand them more deeply. They explain why a ritual must be performed in a certain way, why a misfortune has occurred, or what action must be taken to restore balance. Their position is powerful because it connects the visible world to the invisible one, and the invisible world, by definition, cannot be directly challenged. This creates a space where interpretation carries weight beyond ordinary scrutiny. The potential for manipulation is clear, but so is the potential for sincere guidance. The two are often inseparable. What makes these developments so significant is that they allow for coordination at a scale that direct observation alone cannot support. A group can now act based on shared belief in unseen causes or future outcomes. They can cooperate in ways that are not immediately tied to visible necessity. They can follow rules that extend beyond immediate survival. This is a major step toward complex society. It allows for planning, for division of roles, for continuity across generations. But it also means that behavior can be guided by narratives that are not strictly empirical. The first lie, in this context, is no longer a single act. It is part of a system that shapes how reality itself is understood. There is also a psychological dimension to this transformation. Humans seek patterns. They look for causes. They prefer coherent explanations to randomness. In a world full of uncertainty, a clear story is often more comforting than an accurate but incomplete one. This creates a natural bias toward narratives that simplify and organize experience, even if they distort it. A story that explains why something happened, even incorrectly, can feel more satisfying than admitting that the cause is unknown. This tendency does not disappear in modern societies. It is deeply rooted in how human cognition works. In early communities, it likely plays a crucial role in the acceptance and persistence of shared narratives. The overlap between sincerity and construction becomes especially visible in origin stories. Many groups develop accounts of how they came to be, often involving ancestors, spirits, or transformations that cannot be verified. These stories provide identity and continuity. They explain relationships within the group and with others. They justify claims to land or resources. Over time, they can become so central that questioning them threatens the cohesion of the group itself. Whether these stories began as deliberate fabrications, symbolic expressions, or gradual accumulations of interpretation may be impossible to determine. What matters is that they function as foundational truths within the community. This raises a difficult question that scholars continue to explore: is a shared belief that is not literally true necessarily a lie if it serves a stabilizing function? The answer is not straightforward. In many cases, such beliefs are not experienced as false by those who hold them. They are part of the structure of reality as understood by the group. But from an external perspective, they may appear as distortions. This tension is at the heart of the human story. Civilization, in many forms, is built on shared understandings that go beyond direct observation. Some of these are accurate, some are not. Many exist somewhere in between. As these systems develop, the role of narrative in organizing power becomes more pronounced. A leader may not need to assert dominance directly if their position is embedded within a sacred framework. A rule may not need constant enforcement if it is understood as part of the natural or spiritual order. Compliance becomes internalized. People act not just because they are told to, but because they believe it is right, necessary, or inevitable. This is a profound shift from earlier forms of coordination. It reduces the need for constant monitoring and allows for more complex social structures. At the same time, the potential for exploitation increases. If belief can guide behavior so effectively, then shaping belief becomes a powerful tool. A narrative that elevates one group over another, or one individual over others, can justify unequal distribution of resources or authority. A story that frames suffering as necessary or deserved can reduce resistance. These dynamics are not always consciously engineered. They can emerge gradually as certain interpretations gain prominence. But once established, they can be difficult to dislodge, because they are reinforced by the very structures they support. What survives in the record suggests that early human societies are not passive recipients of such narratives. They adapt, resist, reinterpret, and sometimes replace them. Myths evolve, rituals change, interpretations shift. This fluidity is important. It prevents any single narrative from becoming completely fixed, at least in the early stages, but it also means that the boundary between truth and invention remains dynamic. The first lie, in this broader sense, is not a single event but an ongoing process. It is the continual shaping of shared reality through communication, interpretation, and repetition. By the time these processes are well established, human societies are already operating on multiple layers of reality. There is the physical world, with its immediate demands and constraints, and there is the symbolic world, with its stories, meanings, and expectations. The two are deeply intertwined. Actions in one affect the other. A ritual performed in the symbolic world may influence behavior in the physical one. A narrative about the past may shape decisions in the present. This dual structure is one of the defining features of human civilization, and within it, the legacy of the first lie continues to grow, not as a simple falsehood, but as a capacity embedded in the very systems that make large-scale human life possible. The ability to create, share, and sustain narratives that guide behavior beyond direct observation is both a strength and a vulnerability. It allows humans to build worlds that exist partly in imagination and partly in material reality. But it also means that those worlds can be shaped in ways that are not always aligned with truth. From here, the path leads toward even more tangible transformations. As humans begin to settle, store resources, and formalize relationships, the opportunities for shaping belief will expand further. The sacred and the invented will not disappear. They will take on new forms, more structured, more visible, and more enduring. and with them, the influence of the first lie will continue to deepen, moving from the realm of shared story into the foundations of emerging civilization. Then the landscape changes, and with it the stakes of deception. For most of human existence, wealth is difficult to accumulate in large, lasting quantities. A skilled hunter may return with abundance, but meat spoils. A gatherer may know hidden places rich in food, but those places still belong to the logic of season and movement. Portable objects matter, reputation matters, alliances matter, but material surplus remains unstable. This puts limits on inequality. It does not prevent it entirely, but it keeps advantage close to the body and relatively visible. Then, slowly and unevenly across different parts of the world, people begin to settle more permanently, cultivate crops, store grain, pen animals, and invest labor in land that cannot simply be picked up and carried away. With that change, concealment acquires new depth. The lie is no longer only about immediate intention. It becomes attached to property, counting, obligation, and the management of things that endure. Agriculture is often described as a triumph of control over nature, but in human terms it is also a triumph of delayed consequences. A field is planted months before harvest. Storage pits are filled for seasons not yet arrived. Herds are managed over years. Boundaries harden. Labor can be demanded in advance of reward. Debts can begin without yet having a name. This long horizon creates opportunities for misrepresentation that mobile foraging life contains less easily. A hidden handful of gathered food matters. A hidden share of stored grain matters far more, because it can sustain a household through scarcity, be exchanged for favor, support dependence, or become the base from which future power grows. Once wealth persists through time, lying about wealth becomes historically consequential. The earlier settled communities are still small by later standards, but their internal logic is already changing. A village with fields and granaries must track more things than a moving band. Who planted which plot? Who contributed seed? Who lost crop to flood, blight, or grazing animals? Who borrowed tools? Who owes labor? Who has animals breeding in another family's enclosure? These are not merely practical details. They are social facts, and social facts are vulnerable to manipulation. In communities where direct observation no longer covers every transaction, trust must stretch around hidden stores, delayed returns, and claims about work no one fully witnessed. This creates fertile ground for strategic ambiguity. Grain itself has a peculiar social power. It can be measured, divided, hoarded, and withheld. Unlike many foraged foods, it can sit in silence and wait. It makes accounting thinkable even before accounting is formalized. It also makes theft less visible and inequality easier to preserve. A person can underreport what remains in storage, overstate the damage done by pests, claim losses that did not occur, or quietly shift goods from common expectation into private reserve. The evidence remains incomplete on the exact texture of such deceptions in the earliest farming villages, but the broad direction is hard to miss. The moment people begin storing substantial wealth, the temptation to manage appearances around that wealth intensifies. This does not affect only resources. It affects social relationships as well. Sedentary life changes kinship, inheritance, and marriage patterns because land and stores must pass somehow between generations and households. Once that happens, hidden intentions matter more. Promises tied to future transfers become valuable. Claims of descent grow sharper. Disputes over legitimacy, obligation, and access become more serious because the underlying assets are no longer fleeting. A false claim about parentage in a mobile band may alter alliance. In a settled farming community, it may alter inheritance, labor rights, and long-term standing. The same is true of marriage arrangements, adopted ties, and household membership. Property makes memory political. There is also a subtler transformation at work. Farming communities depend not just on cooperation, but on coordination at a larger temporal scale. Irrigation must be maintained, harvest must be timed, storage must be protected, seeds must be preserved rather than consumed. This means communities increasingly rely on expectations about future behavior. Who will contribute next season? Who will help repair the channel? Who will repay after a bad year? The farther obligation extends into the future, the easier it becomes to exploit uncertainty. Someone can promise labor and fail to deliver. Someone can plead disaster where effort was lacking. Someone can demand patience while quietly converting shared resources into private security. The lie becomes delayed. It no longer always needs immediate belief. It needs only enough time. Scholars have long debated whether agriculture creates hierarchy or merely intensifies tendencies already present in human societies. No single explanation fully accounts for this transition, which unfolds differently in different regions and under different ecological pressures. But what survives in the archaeological record strongly suggests that sedentary life makes durable inequality more feasible. Houses vary, burials vary, storage varies, access varies, and wherever inequality becomes durable, concealment usually follows close behind. Those with more have stronger reasons to defend what they have, justify how they got it, and prevent others from seeing too clearly the gap between public story and material reality. This may be one reason early settled communities often develop strong moral languages around fairness, obligation, reciprocity, and proper conduct. Such values are not new, but they become more heavily burdened. In small mobile groups, repeated face-to-face interaction helps keep opportunism in check. In settled villages, the opportunities for quiet accumulation, selective generosity, and strategic withholding multiply. Moral talk must do more work because the material structure of life now presents more openings for dishonesty. A person can appear cooperative while shifting burdens elsewhere. A household can display piety and generosity publicly while managing stores with private severity. Reputation still matters, but appearances become easier to stage. The village also produces witnesses of a different kind neighbours. In one sense, settlement increases visibility. People live closer together. Work patterns become more regular. Daily routines are more exposed. But this does not guarantee transparency. Closeness can produce concealment as much as clarity. People learn what not to say in front of whom. They develop partial disclosures, careful denials, defensive silences. Envy sharpens. Comparison becomes constant. In such settings, deception often flourishes not in dramatic acts but in habitual understatements and selective truths. Who really had enough grain to share? Who truly lost livestock and who quietly sold them? Who worked hardest in communal labour and who positioned themselves to be seen working? These are small matters until they are not. In aggregate, they reshape the trust on which settled life depends. Another surprising feature of early farming is that it may increase dependence on abstraction. Land itself becomes a social fact that exceeds immediate use. A field is not simply the place one is standing, it is a recognized claim, often remembered across seasons, perhaps across generations. A boundary may be marked physically, but it also exists in the minds of neighbours. The same is true of debts, labour obligations, and expected shares from a harvest not yet gathered. These are invisible realities sustained by collective recognition. They are not lies. They are institutions in embryonic form, but because they are invisible, they are vulnerable to distortion. The person who can influence the recognized story about ownership or obligation gains power over resources no one can hold in hand at that moment. This is where the first lie begins to look startlingly modern, not because ancient villagers resemble bureaucrats or merchants in any complete sense, but because they are now living among deferred claims, hidden reserves, and socially recognized entitlements that cannot be verified instantly. Civilization, in one of its core dimensions, begins here in a world where much of what matters is real, only because other people agree that it is. Land rights, stored value, debts, marriage promises, household membership, inheritance expectations. Once these exist, the lie no longer merely alters a conversation, it alters the structure of future distribution. There is also a darker possibility. Agricultural life may not only create more opportunities for lying, it may make some lies socially necessary from the perspective of emerging hierarchy. If a village contains households with greater access to land, water, labour, or animal wealth, that inequality must somehow be narrated. It can be explained as seniority, blessing, ancestry, superior diligence, ritual favour, or necessity. Some of these explanations may be partly true. Some may be self-serving embellishments. Many are likely mixtures of both. What matters is that unequal conditions now need stories durable enough to prevent constant conflict. Material imbalance begins to recruit ideology. This does not mean early villages are simply traps of exploitation. Many are resilient, cooperative, and inventive. Agriculture supports larger populations, greater continuity, and eventually new forms of craft, ritual, and exchange. But its social cost is profound. It creates more to fight over, more to remember, and more to conceal. The transition from mobile subsistence to stored wealth does not invent human dishonesty, but it changes its scale and texture. The lie becomes more administrative, more patient, more deeply tied to material life. It settles down with the people. By the time substantial food storage, property recognition, and inherited household claims are established, the human social world has crossed another threshold. Falsehood can now cling to objects, places, and promises over long stretches of time. It can survive absence. It can accumulate interest in the broadest sense. A person lies not only about what happened yesterday, but about what belongs to whom, what is owed, what was promised, and what the future requires. Those claims, once accepted, begin shaping the bones of society. And this is why grain matters so much in the history of deception, not because it is morally corrupting in itself, but because it is countable, storable, transferable, and unequally defensible. It invites measurement, and measurement invites dispute. It invites ownership, and ownership invites concealment. It invites long memory, and long memory invites revision. In the old mobile world, survival depends on truth enough to keep the group alive. In the new settled world, truth must also compete with stores, boundaries, and expectations that linger in silence after the speaker has gone. The first lie has entered the granary. From there, it will not remain small for long. The next transformation is almost eerie in its simplicity. For thousands of years, a lie lives and dies in breath. It passes from mouth to ear, from memory to memory, changing slightly as it moves, always vulnerable to forgetting, contradiction, or the death of the speaker. Then at some point, in a few regions of the ancient world, human beings begin to press signs into clay, cut marks into bone, brush symbols onto surfaces, knot chords into counted meaning, and eventually arrange words so that claims can survive the person who made them. With that, deception acquires a body. It becomes durable, portable, and strangely impersonal. A falsehood no longer needs constant retelling by the same voice. It can sit on a shelf, harden in the sun, travel in a basket, cross a border, wait in an archive, or confront someone years later with the authority of inscription. This is one of the most important moments in the long history of the first lie. Writing does not invent deception, it industrializes its memory. The earliest writing systems do not appear as poetry or philosophy. They emerge from management, counting, storage, transfer, taxation, land, labor, offerings, debt. Before writing becomes literature, it is already administration. This matters enormously. The first marks that matter at scale are often not expressive in the modern sense. They are claims. This amount of grain received, that shipment delivered, these labourers assigned, those animals counted. The world of writing begins, in many places, as a world of recorded obligations, and once obligations are recorded, power shifts again. A spoken dispute can be argued against with living witnesses. A written entry arrives with an almost unnatural confidence. It appears settled simply because it is fixed. In Mesopotamia, among the earliest urban societies, clay tablets emerge from exactly this environment of surplus management and organized distribution. Tokens, tallies, seals, and later cuneiform signs help track goods moving through temples, storehouses, and administrative centers. In Egypt, writing becomes tied not only to accounting but to kingship, ritual, and monumental legitimacy. In other early civilizations, different systems arise for overlapping reasons to remember, to order, to claim, to preserve. Scholars still debate the exact social pathways by which writing becomes fully institutional, and no single explanation fully accounts for every region. But what survives in the record suggests a common pattern. Once societies grow large enough that memory alone cannot govern resources, writing enters as a technology of trust. And because it is a technology of trust, it also becomes a technology of controlled falsehood. The power of writing lies partly in how it changes the emotional texture of belief. Spoken claims feel human. They carry hesitation, tone, stress, visible motive. A written claim feels detached from the body. It appears cooler, firmer, less negotiable. Even when read aloud, it brings with it the force of fixity. Someone wrote this down. Someone sealed it. Someone preserved it. The marks themselves seem indifferent to dispute. This can be liberating in one sense. Agreements can outlast memory. Rules can be stabilized. Transactions can be checked. But it also creates a new vulnerability. If the record is false, incomplete, selective, or manipulated, the falsehood acquires unusual authority precisely because it has been formalized. The lie no longer sounds like a personal defense. It looks like reality's official version. That change may be more radical than it first appears. Oral deception is constrained by context. The liar must often remain present to defend the account or rely on others to repeat it. Written deception can travel alone. It can move into places where the original event is unknown, where witnesses are absent, and where the reader has little access to competing evidence. This portability expands the lie's reach beyond face-to-face society. A tax record can overstate what is owed. A boundary record can quietly widen a claim. A labour list can erase some names and inflate others. A tribute inscription can transform extraction into voluntary loyalty. A legal text can encode the interests of the powerful while presenting them as neutral order. The possibilities multiply once symbols can be copied, stored, and invoked by institutions rather than merely by individuals. The seal is one of the great quiet inventions in this story. A mark impressed by a recognized authority gives a document lineage. It links the text to a person, office, or institution, and implies authenticity. In theory, this protects truth. In practice, it also creates a new theatrical layer around authority. A sealed falsehood may be more persuasive than an unsealed truth. The physical signs of legitimacy begin to matter as much as, and sometimes more than, the underlying accuracy of the claim. This is an ancient pattern that survives far beyond the first scribal cultures. People trust form. They trust what looks official. They trust what appears to come from the proper channel. Writing intensifies this tendency by making official form tangible. Royal inscriptions reveal another dimension of the problem. Kings do not usually commission monuments to record confusion, compromise, fear, narrow escape, or partial failure. They inscribe victory, favour, order, piety, expansion, justice, abundance. Even when these claims rest on real achievements, they are often magnified, streamlined, and arranged into narratives of inevitability. Defeats vanish. Rebellion becomes treachery. Extraction becomes rightful tribute. Conquest becomes restoration. The evidence remains incomplete because monuments are made precisely to project a version of reality, not to question it. But what survives across many early civilizations suggests that once rulers can write their claims into stone or clay, the management of belief takes on a new permanence. The king does not merely say he brought order. The wall says it for him long after his body is gone. This does not mean every written text is deceptive or every scribe a conspirator. Writing also preserves contracts, prayers, observations, legal reasoning, astronomical records, and ordinary transactions with remarkable fidelity. It allows complex societies to function. It reduces some forms of fraud by stabilizing memory. Yet every gain in clarity also creates an opening for higher-order manipulation. A law written down appears universal even when applied selectively. A census appears objective even when categories are shaped by power. A list of rations appears precise even when the distribution behind it is uneven. The written record can conceal choice beneath order. It can make contingent arrangements look natural. One of the most important and least obvious effects of writing is that it separates knowledge from immediate communal circulation. In oral societies, though specialists may still hold more authority, much social knowledge depends on repeated public memory. Writing creates archives, offices, and classes of people trained to read and produce records. Literacy is often restricted. That restriction matters. When only some can inspect the signs that govern property, taxation, lineage, or law, those people occupy a privileged position between the social world and its official representation. Scribes, administrators, and priests become custodians not just of information, but of authorized reality. Their task may be honest, but their structural power is enormous. They can define what counts as remembered fact. The history of debt makes this especially clear. A spoken promise can be denied, disputed, or renegotiated through direct social pressure. A written debt, by contrast, acquires endurance. It can outlast crop failure, migration, illness, or the death of one party. It can be inherited, reinterpreted, and enforced later under change conditions. This makes lending and administration more powerful, but it also exposes the vulnerable to a new kind of trap. A single recorded claim can continue acting in the world even when the circumstances that produced it have disappeared. If the entry is manipulated, the injustice is not momentary, it is institutional. The lie remains active. Legal texts deepen the transformation. Once rules are written, they appear to stand above persons. This can restrain arbitrary power, and in some contexts it does. But laws are not neutral simply because they are written. They are composed, arranged, and enforced by someone. They privilege certain harms over others, certain households over others, certain classes, genders, offices, or lineages over others. A legal code can therefore embody selective reality while presenting itself as general truth. It may describe the social order not as contested or historical, but as proper. The very act of inscription can disguise the political choices beneath it. Scholars continue to debate how early law codes functioned in daily practice, whether as strict enforceable rules, aspirational royal statements, or something in between. But whatever their precise use, they demonstrate the same principle. Writing makes power's preferred version of reality repeatable. There is a darker irony here. Writing arises partly because trust can no longer rest entirely on memory. Larger societies need external supports. Records help strangers transact, institutions coordinate, and rulers govern beyond immediate sight. In that sense, writing is a response to the fragility of oral trust. But once installed, it does not solve the problem of deception, it relocates it. The question becomes not only whether a speaker is honest, but whether the record is complete. Who produced it? Under what authority? For whose interest? And who is allowed to contest it? Truth does not become automatic when marked in clay. It becomes administrative. What survives from the earliest written worlds often comes to us through precisely those channels most invested in managing belief palaces, temples, officials, estates, courts. This means the archive itself is not a transparent window into the past. It is a preserved layer of selective attention. We know more about tribute than about private hunger, more about official order than about quiet resentment, more about the king's victories than about the villages that paid for them. The written record is invaluable, but it is never innocent. It carries within it the priorities of the institutions that generated it. In that sense, the archive is one of civilization's grandest achievements and one of its most sophisticated masks. And still, human beings come to trust it because they must. Complex life becomes impossible without some durable medium of verification. The question is never whether writing should exist. It is how writing reshapes the struggle between truth and advantage. Once the lie can be archived, copied, stamped, and invoked by office holders who never witnessed the original event, deception takes on a scale the campfire world could never sustain. It leaves the rhythm of conversation and enters infrastructure. The first lie, then, has crossed another threshold. It is no longer merely spoken by the hungry, the frightened, the ambitious, or the proud. It is entered in ledgers, carved in monuments, sealed in transactions, preserved in legal formulas, and recited as official memory. It gains weight from material form. A falsehood with a body is harder to kill than one made of breath alone. And once societies learn to trust signs because they endure, they also learn, often too slowly, that endurance is not the same thing as truth. By the time writing, storage, and organized labor converge, something new appears in human history: the state, not suddenly, not everywhere at once, and not in a single uniform form, but gradually, unevenly, and with enormous variation. Human societies begin to produce structures capable of coordinating thousands, then tens of thousands, and eventually millions of people. Fields are planned, water is directed, labor is assigned, surplus is collected, boundaries are enforced. And at the center of all this, something invisible holds it together. Not just force, though force is present, not just fear, though fear plays its part, but belief managed, repeated, and carefully aligned with power. The earliest states face a problem no small human group ever had to solve: at scale, how to make strangers cooperate reliably. In a village, people know one another. Reputation travels quickly. Deception is constrained by proximity. In a state, most individuals will never meet those who govern them, and often not even those whose labor supports them. Direct trust is impossible at that scale. Something must replace it. That something is not truth in the pure sense. It is structured belief narratives, symbols, rituals, and recorded claims that create the impression of order, legitimacy, and inevitability. Consider the simplest example, taxation. For a state to function, it must extract resources from its population: grain, labor, goods, or later money. But extraction alone does not sustain stability. If people perceive it as arbitrary theft, resistance grows. So taxation is rarely presented as mere taking. It is framed as duty, as protection, as necessity, as contribution to something larger than the individual. In early river valley civilizations, this framing often takes sacred form. The king does not simply demand grain. The king maintains cosmic balance, ensures the flood, protects the land, mediates between the human and the divine. The grain is not just taken. It is offered into a system that sustains the world. Scholars still debate how deeply these beliefs were held and how consciously they were shaped. But the pattern is clear across multiple early civilizations. Authority is rarely justified purely in practical terms. It is embedded in narratives that elevate it beyond ordinary challenge. In Egypt, the pharaoh is not merely a ruler, but part of the divine order. In Mesopotamia, kingship is presented as granted by the gods. In early China, rulers govern under a mandate tied to cosmic harmony. These ideas are not identical, and they evolve over time, but they share a common function. They transform power from a contingent arrangement into something that appears necessary and natural. This transformation is not purely deceptive. It often rests on real achievements. Early states build irrigation systems, organize labor for large-scale projects, stabilize regions, and create forms of continuity that smaller groups cannot sustain. People benefit from these systems, even as they are constrained by them. The narrative of legitimacy often contains truth, but it is also selective. It emphasizes order over coercion, stability over extraction, divine favor over human negotiation. The lie, in this context, is not always a direct falsehood. It is the careful shaping of reality into a form that supports authority. Monumental architecture plays a crucial role in reinforcing these narratives. Massive structures, temples, pyramids, walls, palaces are not only functional, they are symbolic. They demonstrate capacity, permanence, and control over labor and materials. They make abstract claims visible. A ruler who can mobilize thousands to build in stone appears powerful in a way that words alone cannot convey. But the meaning of that power is not self-evident. It must be interpreted. And that interpretation is guided by narrative. The structure becomes proof not just of strength, but of rightful order. It suggests that the system works, that the ruler is effective, that the world is aligned under their authority. Writing amplifies this effect. Inscriptions on monuments, decrees, and records all contribute to a consistent story about how the state functions. They present a version of events that support stability. Victories are recorded, laws are codified, lineages are traced. Even when these accounts are grounded in reality, they are rarely complete. Defeats may be omitted, internal conflicts minimized, failures reframed. The result is a curated history that becomes the official memory of the society. People grow up within it. They learn it as part of their understanding of the world. It becomes difficult to see beyond it. One of the most effective tools in this system is repetition. A single claim may be questioned, a claim repeated across rituals, inscriptions, education, and daily practice becomes normalized. It no longer feels like a claim. It feels like the background of reality. This is how states manage belief at scale, not through constant coercion, but through saturation. The narrative is everywhere, in ceremonies, in architecture, in records, in expectations. It becomes the default frame through which people interpret events. There is also a practical dimension to this. Large societies require coordination that cannot rely on constant verification. People must act on information they cannot fully check. A farmer must trust that the irrigation system will be maintained. A labourer must trust that their contribution fits into a larger plan. A trader must trust that measures and agreements hold across distance. These forms of trust are not purely interpersonal, they are institutional. They depend on shared belief in systems that are partly abstract. The state provides that belief, or at least claims to. This creates a feedback loop. The more people act as if the system is legitimate, the more stable it becomes. The more stable it becomes, the more it appears legitimate. This does not eliminate conflict or resistance, but it reduces the need for constant force. People comply not only because they are compelled, but because they accept, at least to some degree, the narrative that frames their role. At the same time, the potential for deception increases dramatically. When belief is managed at scale, small distortions can have large effects. A policy justified by an incomplete or misleading narrative can reshape entire regions. A ruler's claim to divine favour can suppress dissent. A record that misrepresents distribution can hide inequality. These are not isolated lies. They are systemic. They operate through institutions that give them durability and reach. It is important not to imagine early states as monolithic or perfectly controlled. They are often unstable, contested, and subject to internal tension. Different groups within the state may hold different interpretations. Local practices may diverge from official narratives. Resistance, negotiation, and adaptation are constant. What survives in the record often reflects the perspective of those with the power to record, not the full range of lived experience. This means the apparent coherence of early state narratives may be partly an artifact of preservation. Even so, the underlying dynamic is clear. The state depends on a shared understanding of reality that goes beyond direct experience. That understanding is shaped, reinforced, and sometimes distorted by those in positions of authority. The first lie, in this context, is no longer a single act or even a series of acts. It is embedded in the structure of governance. It becomes part of how societies organize themselves. There is a revealing contrast between how individuals experience this system and how it is presented. For the individual, life may involve hard labor, uncertainty, and limited control over broader decisions. For the official narrative, the same life is part of a harmonious order, sustained by rightful authority and shared purpose. Both perspectives can contain elements of truth. The tension between them is where much of human history unfolds. Scholars continue to explore how much early populations believed in the narratives that surrounded them and how much they recognized their constructed nature. The answer likely varies widely. Some may have accepted them fully, others may have held private doubts while publicly conforming. Still others may have actively resisted or reinterpreted them. The evidence remains incomplete, but it suggests a spectrum rather than a single condition. What is certain is that once belief becomes a tool of governance, it cannot be easily separated from power. The management of information, interpretation, and narrative becomes as important as the management of resources and labor. The state, in its earliest forms, is not just an economic or military system. It is an informational system. It organizes what people know, what they think they know, and what they are encouraged to believe. From this point forward, the trajectory is set. As societies grow more complex, the mechanisms for shaping belief become more elaborate. Religion, law, education, and later media all play roles in this process. Each adds new layers, new techniques, and new scales of influence. But the underlying principle remains the same as it was in the earliest human groups. People act not only on reality, but on their understanding of reality. And that understanding can be shaped. The first lie, which began as a small adjustment in a moment of need, has now become part of the machinery of civilization. It no longer needs to hide. It can stand in plain sight, embedded in systems that appear natural and necessary. It does not always look like a lie. Often it looks like order. And that may be its most enduring transformation. At this point, the story has travelled a long way from the firelit uncertainty of small human groups. The lie has moved through language, ritual, surplus, writing, and state power, gradually becoming harder to isolate because it now lives inside systems larger than any one speaker. But if the subject is the very first lie in human history, there is an obvious problem. Where is the proof? What can actually be known? And what is only a compelling reconstruction? Here the story must slow down and become more careful, because the evidence for early deception is both rich in implication and brutally limited in direct confirmation. No archaeologist uncovers dishonesty in the way they uncover grain residue or worked flint. A lie does not petrify. It does not leave a clean layer in the ground. It survives, if at all, indirectly. In mismatched records, in suspiciously self-serving inscriptions, in burials that imply status claims more complex than practical need, in legal formulas that suggest repeated conflict over ownership or obligation, in anthropological comparisons showing how human groups manage reputation, cheating, boasting, concealment, and trust, in cognitive science demonstrating that deception depends on theory of mind, symbolic flexibility, and memory control. The evidence is real, but it is scattered across disciplines, and it must be assembled with caution. Archaeology gives the broadest frame. It shows when humans begin relying heavily on cooperation, symbolic behavior, delayed return economies, food storage, property-like claims, and institutional records. Each of these developments expands the opportunity space for deception. A society with no storage can still lie, but it cannot lie about granary contents. A society without writing can still manipulate memory, but it cannot formalize manipulation in durable ledgers. A society without hierarchy can still exaggerate status, but it cannot easily attach exaggeration to permanent office. Archaeology therefore does not reveal the first lie itself. It reveals the social worlds in which different kinds of lies become possible, useful, and eventually structural. Anthropology helps fill in some of the human texture. Studies of small-scale societies, though never direct windows into prehistory, show how intensely communities monitor fairness, generosity, reciprocity, sexual conduct, and truthfulness. They also show that deception is not an alien intrusion into cooperative life. It exists within it. People boast, conceal, test one another, spread reputational information, manage impressions, and punish cheaters. This matters because it demonstrates that close-knit, non-state societies are not worlds of transparent innocence. They are morally dense environments where trust and manipulation coexist. Scholars remain careful here, because no living foraging or horticultural society can be treated as a frozen remnant of the Paleolithic. Histories differ, ecologies differ, colonial disruptions matter, and comparison can mislead. Still, what survives from ethnographic work suggests that the tension between cooperation and deception is deep and durable. Cognitive science offers another crucial layer. Human deception, in the full sense, requires several abilities that can be studied even if their origins cannot be dated precisely. A liar must grasp that another person has a mind with beliefs inside it. They must understand that those beliefs can diverge from reality. They must track what the other person knows or does not know. They must inhibit the truth, generate an alternative, and present it convincingly enough to pass. This is not a trivial mental feat. It depends on theory of mind, executive control, memory, and language or language-like symbolic communication. Children today do not master these abilities all at once. Developmental studies suggest that successful lying appears gradually as cognitive capacities mature. That does not tell us when the first lie was told in prehistory, but it does tell us the kind of mind required to tell it. Primatology complicates the picture in useful ways. Other primates mislead. They conceal food, bluff intention, redirect attention, and behave strategically in social competition. This strongly suggests that the roots of deception are older than Homo sapiens and perhaps older than the genus Homo itself. But there is a difference between strategic concealment and fully symbolic falsehood. A chimpanzee hiding food from a dominant individual is not the same as a human constructing a verbal account of an event that never happened. The line is not absolute, and scholars still debate how sharply it should be drawn, but the distinction matters. The first lie in human history, if defined as deliberate symbolic falsification, probably depends on capacities that become especially powerful in our species. The biological roots may be ancient. The cultural consequences are overwhelmingly human. Ancient texts, where available, provide more direct evidence, though of a later period. By the time writing appears, deception is already familiar enough to be regulated, condemned, exploited, and narratively elaborated. Law codes concern false claims, false witness, disputed boundaries, unpaid debts, and concealed obligations. Wisdom literature warns against flattering speech, dishonest measures, and fraudulent dealings. Royal inscriptions exaggerate victories and smooth over failure. Administrative texts reveal systems where record and reality do not always sit comfortably together. This is not the first lie, of course. It is already a mature world of institutionalized representation, but it proves beyond much doubt that once societies become legible to themselves through writing, they are also capable of embedding deception in law, trade, governance, and memory. There are also material clues that suggest social signaling beyond straightforward function. Prestige goods, elaborate burials, monumental displays, and symbolic markers of status all raise questions. Are these honest representations of actual power, wealth, or sacred role? Or are they curated images designed to persuade the living? Often the answer is both. A burial filled with valuable objects may reflect genuine status, while also amplifying it for political effect. A monument may commemorate a real event while reshaping its meaning. The evidence remains incomplete because material culture rarely arrives with motive attached. But what survives in the record suggests that humans have long been skilled at turning things into arguments about who mattered and why. One of the most important methodological problems is separating lying from ordinary human error. People misremember, they infer wrongly, they simplify, they repeat rumors they believe to be true. They turn accidents into patterns because the mind dislikes randomness. This means not every false statement in history belongs to deception. Intent matters, but intent is usually the hardest thing to recover. A king may sincerely believe he rules by divine favor. A scribe may copy a distorted figure without thinking it false. A village elder may repeat an origin story understood as sacred truth rather than manipulation. The boundary between deliberate falsehood, collective belief, mythic narrative, and adaptive simplification is often blurred. That is why the phrase first lie is both powerful and unstable. It sounds singular. The evidence points instead to a long zone of overlap where misrepresentation, sincerity, performance, and shared fiction grow together. This is especially important when considering religion. It is far too simple to describe early sacred systems as lies invented by elites to control others. Some elements may indeed be used that way, but religious thought also emerges from grief, awe, fear, pattern-seeking, moral imagination, and sincere attempts to organize existence. The same is true of myth more broadly. A story can be empirically false and socially meaningful without having been cynically fabricated. Scholars continue to debate how much early authority is built through conscious manipulation versus gradual sedimentation of shared belief. No single explanation fully accounts for this. Some power structures clearly exploit sacred narrative. Some sacred narrative seems to arise before centralized power. Often the two become entangled so tightly that motive is impossible to untangle after the fact. Economics and administrative history provide some of the clearest evidence for deception once complex societies form. Fraud leaves a faint but recognizable shadow in systems that count. False weights, altered measures, disputed contracts, forged seals, manipulated debt records, and mismatched deliveries all point to the same thing once value is abstracted and recorded. People try to bend the abstractions. Here, the lie becomes visible through anomalies. It is no longer just an idea. It creates discrepancies between expected and actual distributions, between law and practice, between official memory and lived consequence. This is not just morally interesting, it is historically revealing. It shows where systems become vulnerable precisely because they rely on trust in symbols. What, then, can be said with confidence? A few things. Human societies depend deeply on trust, testimony, and shared representation. Deception appears in simpler forms across the animal world and in more elaborate forms wherever human cognition and symbolic communication are sufficiently developed. The growth of language, delayed return economies, social hierarchy, ritual authority, writing, and states all expand the opportunities and rewards for deception. Ancient written societies unquestionably regulate and exploit falsehood in sophisticated ways, and throughout this long arc, human communities also develop countermeasures norms, punishments, corroboration, reputation tracking, legal controls, and moral teachings aimed at preserving enough truth for cooperation to endure. What cannot be said with confidence is equally important. We cannot identify a first liar, a first date, or a first exact statement. We cannot know whether the earlier symbolic lie concerned food, fear, sex, status, ritual, or blame. We cannot cleanly separate prehistorical deception from self-deception, myth-making, or error. We cannot assume all shared fictions are cynical, nor can we assume they are harmless. The record does not allow that kind of certainty. What it allows is a strong inference once humans became creatures who lived in each other's minds through language and symbol. Deception became not an accident at the edge of culture, but one of culture's permanent possibilities. This may be the strangest part of the evidence. It does not show a lost Eden of truth later corrupted by institutions, nor does it show deception as the only real engine beneath all human life. Instead, it reveals a species balanced precariously between dependence and manipulation. We need trustworthy communication so badly that civilization cannot function without it. We're also capable, from very early on, of exploiting that trust for advantage. The archaeological record, the ethnographic record, the cognitive record, and the textual record all converge on that uneasy conclusion. So when we ask about the first lie in human history, the most honest answer is not a scene, but a threshold, a point, or rather a long crossing, where human beings become able to shape one another's behavior through symbols that need not match reality. The evidence does not give us the first sentence. It gives us the first conditions under which such a sentence could change the world. And once those conditions exist, the rest of the story begins to look less like an anomaly and more like a recurring feature of civilization itself, our extraordinary ability to build shared realities, and our equally extraordinary ability to bend them. Once the evidence has been gathered and the limits of certainty acknowledged, the question shifts from when the first lie happened to why it happens at all, not as an accident, not as a moral failure alone, but as something that appears again and again wherever humans build shared realities. Scholars approach this question from different angles, and no single explanation fully accounts for it. But taken together, these perspectives reveal something unsettling. Deception may not be a flaw at the edge of civilization. It may be woven into the very mechanisms that make civilization possible. One of the oldest explanations is biological. From this view, deception is an extension of competition within cooperation. Human beings evolved in groups where survival depended on mutual aid, but also where individuals competed for resources, status, and reproductive success. In such environments, the ability to mislead could offer advantages. A person who can appear more capable, more reliable, or more connected than they actually are may gain access to opportunities others do not. At the same time, others evolve the ability to detect such deception. The result is an ongoing evolutionary tension, an arms race between signaling and skepticism. This does not mean humans are naturally dishonest in any simple sense. It means that the capacity for dishonesty persists because, under certain conditions, it works. A second explanation focuses on language itself. Once humans develop the ability to describe things that are not immediately present, they gain enormous cognitive flexibility. They can plan, teach, imagine, and coordinate across time and space. But this same flexibility allows them to describe things that are not true. Language does not distinguish between accurate and inaccurate statements on its own. It is a tool, and like any tool, it can be used in multiple ways. From this perspective, the first lie is not a separate invention. It is an inevitable byproduct of symbolic communication. If you can say what is, you can also say what is not. Another line of thought emphasizes social complexity. As groups grow larger and more structured, direct knowledge of others becomes impossible. People must rely on second-hand information, reputation, and institutional signals. This creates opportunities for manipulation, but it also creates incentives for it. In a large society, shaping how others perceive you can be more efficient than demonstrating your qualities directly. Narratives become shortcuts. They allow individuals and institutions to influence behavior at scale. From this view, deception expands because the social environment rewards it, especially when it can be embedded in systems that give it durability. There is also a psychological explanation rooted in how humans process information. People do not simply absorb facts, they interpret them through existing beliefs, emotions, and expectations. They look for patterns, prefer coherence, and often accept explanations that fit what they already think or hope to be true. This makes them vulnerable to misleading narratives, but it also makes such narratives effective. A lie that aligns with existing assumptions is easier to believe and more likely to spread. This does not require malicious intent, it is a feature of cognition. But it means that once deception appears, it can propagate through ordinary mental processes. A more controversial perspective suggests that some forms of deception are not just tolerated but necessary for large-scale cooperation. Complex societies rely on abstractions, money, law, citizenship, authority, identity. These are not tangible objects. They exist because people collectively agree that they exist. In that sense, they are shared fictions. They are not lies in the sense of deliberate falsehood, but they are constructs that go beyond direct physical reality. Without them, coordination at scale becomes extremely difficult. Some scholars argue that the ability to believe in such constructs and to act on them is one of the defining features of Homo sapiens. From this angle, the line between useful fiction and harmful deception becomes difficult to draw. This leads to a deeper and more uncomfortable question. If civilization depends in part on shared beliefs that are not strictly empirical, where does one place the first lie within that system? Is it the moment someone knowingly misleads others for personal gain? Or is it the broader moment when humans begin living inside realities that exist partly in imagination? The answer may be both. The first lie, in the narrow sense, is a deliberate act. But the conditions that make it possible are the same conditions that make culture, law, and society possible. This is why the topic resists simple moral framing. Deception is not just opposed to civilization, it is entangled with it. Another theory looks at deception as a form of social strategy rather than a breakdown of ethics. In this view, humans navigate complex environments by balancing honesty and manipulation depending on context. Absolute honesty may be costly in some situations. Absolute dishonesty is unsustainable. The optimal strategy lies somewhere in between, shaped by norms, expectations, and consequences. This perspective is supported by observations across cultures, where people tend to value honesty but also recognize exceptions, whether for protection, politeness, or strategic advantage. The evidence suggests that human societies do not eliminate deception, they regulate it. There is also the question of scale. A lie told in a small group has limited reach. A lie embedded in an institution can affect thousands or millions. As societies grow, the potential impact of deception increases dramatically. This is why later forms of organized misinformation, propaganda, and ideological control become so powerful. They build on the same basic mechanisms as early deception, but they operate through systems that amplify their effects. The first lie, in this sense, is not just an origin point. It is a template that can be expanded. Scholars disagree on which of these explanations is most important, and many argue that they are not mutually exclusive. Biological tendencies, cognitive processes, social structures, and cultural practices all interact. Deception emerges from their intersection. It is shaped by incentives, constrained by norms, enabled by communication, and amplified by institutions. This complexity makes it difficult to isolate a single cause or moment, but it also explains why deception persists across time and across very different kinds of societies. One of the most revealing aspects of these theories is that they all point to the same underlying tension. Humans need reliable information to survive and cooperate. At the same time, they benefit from the ability to manipulate information under certain conditions. This creates a constant negotiation. Societies develop mechanisms to encourage honesty and discourage harmful deception, but they also leave space for flexibility. That flexibility can be used constructively or destructively. The boundary is not fixed. This tension is visible even in modern systems, but its roots extend far back into prehistory. The same cognitive abilities that allow a person to comfort a child with reassuring words also allow a person to mislead a group. The same social structures that enable large-scale cooperation also create opportunities for exploitation. The same narratives that unify communities can also exclude or misrepresent. These are not separate phenomena. They are different expressions of the same underlying capacities. What survives in the scholarly debate is not a single answer, but a pattern. Deception appears wherever humans rely on shared understanding. It grows as that understanding becomes more complex. It is constrained by the need for trust, but never eliminated. It adapts to new forms of communication and new social arrangements. It becomes more subtle as detection improves, and it remains deeply connected to the features that make human life distinctive: language, imagination, cooperation, and culture. So the first lie is not just a historical curiosity, it is a window into a fundamental aspect of human existence. It shows how a species capable of extraordinary cooperation also carries within it the capacity to distort that cooperation. It reveals that truth and falsehood are not separate domains, but interdependent forces shaping how people live together. From this point, the story moves toward consequence, not just why deception exists, but what it has done, how it has shaped the rise of civilizations, the formation of identities, the distribution of power, and the structure of the modern world. Because once the first lie becomes part of the human toolkit, it does not remain small. It scales, evolves, and embeds itself in ways that reach far beyond the moment of its origin. If deception is not an anomaly but a recurring feature of human systems, then the next question becomes unavoidable. What has it actually done? Not in isolated moments, but across the long arc of civilization. The answer is not simple, because deception has not acted alone. It moves alongside cooperation, innovation, belief, and necessity. It distorts, but it also sometimes enables. It undermines trust. Yet it can also help construct the very frameworks that make large-scale trust possible. This is the paradox at the center of the story. Civilization may not have been built on truth alone. One of the clearest places to see this is in the emergence of money. At its core, money is a shared belief, a piece of metal, a stamped token, a marked surface, or later a number in an account, represents value not because of its physical properties alone, but because people agree that it does. That agreement allows trade to expand far beyond direct exchange. It allows strangers to transact, debts to be measured, and resources to move across time and space. But this system depends entirely on trust in the representation. If the symbol is manipulated, debased coinage, altered weights, false accounting, the system destabilizes. The concept itself is not a lie, but it is a constructed reality that can be bent, stretched, or exploited. The first lie, in this context, echoes inside every abstraction that requires belief to function. Law operates in a similar way. A legal system defines what counts as ownership, obligation, harm, and justice. These definitions are not inherent in nature. They are agreed upon, recorded, and enforced. Law creates a shared framework that allows complex societies to function, but it also reflects the interests and power structures of those who shape it. A law can present itself as universal while benefiting some more than others. It can frame inequality as order. It can define certain actions as legitimate and others as criminal in ways that align with existing hierarchies. Again, this is not always deliberate deception, but it often involves selective representation. The system works because people believe in it, even when that belief rests on partial or distorted foundations. Religion provides perhaps the most powerful and enduring example. Across civilizations, religious systems have organized societies, guided behavior, and provided meaning in the face of uncertainty and death. They have inspired art, ethics, and community. At the same time, they have been used to justify authority, enforce norms, and sometimes suppress dissent. The question of whether religious beliefs are true, symbolic, or constructed is deeply contested and varies across traditions. But from a structural perspective, they demonstrate how shared narratives about unseen realities can guide large populations. The first lie, if understood as the capacity to shape belief beyond direct evidence, finds one of its most expansive expressions here. Identity is another domain shaped by constructed narratives. Nations, ethnic groups, and cultural identities are often built on stories about origins, shared pasts, and common characteristics. These stories can be rooted in real events, but they are frequently simplified, emphasized, or reinterpreted to create cohesion. They define who belongs and who does not. They can unite people across vast distances and differences, but they can also exclude, divide, and justify conflict. The boundary between accurate history and useful narrative is often blurred. What matters is not only what happened, but how it is told. As societies become more complex, the management of information becomes a central function of power. Control over what is recorded, taught, and communicated allows institutions to shape perception at scale. Education systems, official histories, and later media all play roles in this process. They do not operate in a vacuum. They reflect the values, priorities, and sometimes the biases of those who design them. This does not mean all information is false. It means that information is structured. Certain perspectives are highlighted, others minimized. The resulting picture of reality is organized, but not always complete. The expansion of communication technologies amplifies these dynamics. Writing allows ideas to persist. Printing allows them to spread widely. Electronic media allows them to reach almost instantly across vast distances. Each step increases the scale at which belief can be influenced. The mechanisms are different, but the underlying principle remains the same. People act on what they believe to be true. If belief can be shaped, behavior can be guided. This is where the consequences of the first lie become most visible. not in a single moment, but in the cumulative effect of countless acts of representation, interpretation, and sometimes distortion. Entire economic systems, political structures, and cultural identities are built on layers of shared understanding. Some of those layers are accurate, some are incomplete, some are deliberately shaped. Together, they form the world as it is experienced by those within it. It's important to recognize that deception does not operate unchecked. Societies develop countermeasures, transparency, accountability, verification, and critical thinking all emerge as responses to the risks of misinformation. Scientific methods aim to separate observation from interpretation. Legal systems include procedures for evidence and testimony. Journalism, in its ideal form, seeks to investigate and report accurately. These efforts reflect a recognition that reliable information is essential for functioning systems. They are attempts to strengthen the infrastructure of truth. Yet these countermeasures are never perfect. They can be bypassed, manipulated, or undermined. The same systems designed to reveal truth can be used to obscure it. A report can be framed selectively. Data can be presented in misleading ways. Authority can be invoked to silence questioning. The struggle between truth and deception continues, not as a simple battle, but as an ongoing negotiation within every layer of society. What makes this particularly complex is that not all distortions are malicious. Some arise from perspective, limitation, or the need to simplify. A historian must choose which events to emphasize. A teacher must condense vast information into teachable form. A leader must present decisions in ways that maintain stability. These acts involve selection and framing. They are necessary, but they also shape understanding. The line between clarification and distortion is often subtle. Over time, these processes create feedback loops. Narratives influence behavior. Behavior reinforces narratives. Systems stabilize around shared beliefs. Challenging those beliefs becomes difficult because they are embedded in institutions, identities, and daily practices. Change requires not just new information, but a shift in the underlying framework of understanding. This is why major transformations in history often involve not only material changes, but changes in how people interpret the world. The first lie, then, is not just an origin point. It is a pattern that repeats at different scales and in different forms. It appears in personal interactions, in social dynamics, in institutional structures, and in global systems. It evolves with technology and adapts to new contexts. It is constrained by the need for trust, but it never disappears. This does not mean that civilization is built on falsehood. It means that civilization is built on representation, and representation is always vulnerable to distortion. The same capacity that allows humans to share knowledge, coordinate action, and build complex systems also allows them to misrepresent, exaggerate, and manipulate. Understanding this does not lead to a simple conclusion. It does not suggest that truth is unattainable or that deception is inevitable in every aspect of life. It suggests that the relationship between truth and belief is dynamic. It requires constant attention. It depends on systems, norms, and individual choices. From the earliest human groups to modern global societies, the pattern holds. Trust enables cooperation. Deception exploits trust. Systems evolve to manage both. And through it all, humans continue to build worlds not only out of material resources, but out of shared understanding. The first lie reshaped civilization not by a single act, but by opening a pathway through which belief could be guided, systems could be stabilized, and power could be exercised in ways that extend far beyond direct force. that pathway remains open. By the time the pathway's fully open, deception no longer belongs to the margins of social life. It becomes part of the operating environment. What began as a tactical falsehood in a small human circle now moves through entire civilizations as doctrine, ceremony, bureaucracy, spectacle, ideology, and administrative habit. It does not always appear in the crude form of a direct lie. More often it appears as selection, framing, omission, moral disguise, or the patient repetition of stories that make unequal systems feel natural. From this point on, the history of civilization is not merely the history of cities, empires, laws, and technologies. It is also the history of managed belief. Empire is one of the clearest expressions of this transformation. No empire rules by force alone for long. The territory is too wide, the populations too varied, the distances too great. Soldiers can occupy, punish, and intimidate, but they cannot continuously explain why tribute should flow, why distant authority should be obeyed, why local identity should be subordinated to a larger order. For that, empire needs narrative. It needs to present conquest as peace, extraction as protection, and hierarchy as civilization. This pattern appears again and again across history. Expansion is described as restoration. Rule is cast as benevolence. Violence is pushed to the edges of official memory while roads, monuments, and law are placed at the center. The imperial lie is rarely that nothing good was built. It is that the good can be separated cleanly from the coercion that financed it. The same is true of bureaucracy, which may seem at first to be the enemy of deception. Bureaucratic systems count, file, classify, and standardize. They promise neutral procedure. They create the impression that personal distortion is being replaced by impersonal order. In many ways, this is a real achievement. Bureaucracy can reduce arbitrary decision-making, preserve records, and make large-scale coordination possible. Yet it also creates a uniquely modern style of concealment. Once decisions are broken into forms, categories, and procedures, responsibility becomes diffuse. Harm can be described as compliance. Exclusion can be described as classification. Unequal treatment can be described as administrative necessity. A lie no longer needs a liar standing in view. It can be distributed across a system in which each participant handles only a fragment. This is one of the strangest evolutions of the first lie. It becomes less theatrical and more routine. In early societies, deception often still carries the heat of personality. Someone hides grain, alters a story, claims divine favor, magnifies ancestry. In bureaucratic civilization, distortion can arrive without raised voices. A number is entered in a way that shifts a burden. A census category erases people who do not fit. A legal definition narrows the range of those entitled to protection. A report emphasizes success and files failure under exceptions. The result may be just as consequential as an ancient royal boast, but it feels less dramatic because it is embedded in normal process. Civilization learns to hide falsehood inside procedure. Ideology extends this pattern even further. An ideology is not merely a set of ideas. It is a way of organizing perception so that certain arrangements appear inevitable, moral, or beyond serious question. It tells people what history means, what society is for, who belongs at the center, who belongs at the edges, and what forms of suffering should be treated as unfortunate, deserved, or invisible. Ideological systems are powerful because they do not simply tell people what to think. They shape the categories through which people interpret evidence in the first place. A person living inside a strong ideology does not necessarily feel lied to. They feel that reality has already been explained. This is why later civilizations can sustain contradictions that would seem impossible in the abstract. A society may praise justice while maintaining obvious inequality. It may speak constantly of freedom while relying on unfree labor. It may call itself civilized while normalizing extermination at its frontiers. It may celebrate truth while rewarding those who preserve convenient illusions. These are not isolated hypocrisies floating at the surface of the otherwise coherent systems. They are signs that managed belief has become structural. The official story and the lived reality do not fully align, but enough people are induced, trained, or pressured to act as though they do. The rise of mass literacy and mass communication does not solve this problem. It intensifies it. Printing expands the circulation of knowledge, but it also expands the circulation of rumor, doctrine, forgery, and coordinated persuasion. Newspapers can expose corruption or manufacture consent. Schools can teach critical thought or encode official myth more deeply into the population. Radio, film, television, and digital systems bring new speed, reach, and intimacy to the management of belief. Each technology increases the number of minds that can be coordinated around the same narrative at the same moment. Each also increases the stakes when the narrative is false. Propaganda is the most explicit form of this development, but it is not the only one. The word itself often calls to mind total war, dictatorships, posters, slogans, and orchestrated public spectacles. Those certainly matter. They show how thoroughly modern states can colonize attention and emotion. But propaganda in the broader sense is simply the systematic shaping of perception for political ends. It can be loud or quiet, centralized or dispersed, state-driven or commercial, sacred or secular. Its effectiveness depends on something ancient. Human beings continue to act on representations of reality, not on reality in some pure untouched form. The first lie becomes a world system once institutions learn to coordinate those representations continuously. A surprising detail in this long history is that large systems often rely less on outrageous falsehood than on manageable partial truth. Total fabrication is fragile. It collapses under basic contact with experience unless backed by overwhelming coercion. More durable forms of deception mix reality with interpretation. They offer enough truth to remain believable while directing attention away from what matters most. An empire really may build roads. A government really may maintain order. A company really may innovate. A religious institution really may comfort the grieving. The distortion lies in turning those truths into a complete explanation that erases exploitation, exclusion, or domination. The most powerful lie is often not the invention of something unreal, but the arrangement of the real into a morally convenient shape. This arrangement shapes modern life in ways so ordinary they are easy to miss. People live within financial systems whose abstractions they rarely inspect fully. They inherit national histories already edited into usable identity. They participate in labor structures framed as meritocratic, even where opportunity is unequally distributed. They consume information through channels optimized not only for accuracy, but for retention, emotion, affiliation, and advantage. None of this requires a single mastermind. Managed belief often works best when it is decentralized, when countless actors align around incentives that reward simplification, dramatization, concealment, and repetition. At that stage, deception becomes ecological. It lives in the environment. And yet civilization cannot abandon truth. That is the paradox that prevents this story from collapsing into cynicism. Every large human system still depends on some minimum level of reliable information. Bridges must actually hold. Crops must be counted with tolerable accuracy. Disease must be recognized. Contracts must be readable. Weather must be measured. Machines must work. Armies must know where they are going. The more complex the society, the more fatal total unreality becomes. This is why every civilization develops truth-producing institutions as well as truth-distorting ones. Courts, archives, sciences, audits, witness procedures, investigative traditions, peer review, journalism, measurement standards. These are not proof that deception has been defeated. They are proof that deception became dangerous enough to require organized resistance. What survives across this long expansion is not a victory of lies over truth or truth over lies, but a permanent contest between them. The first lie matters because it introduced a possibility that could never again be contained at the scale of the individual. Once human beings learn to coordinate around symbols, they also learn to manipulate the coordination. Once institutions formed, they inherited the same capacity. Once technology amplified institutions, the reach of that capacity widened beyond anything the first liar, whoever they were, could have imagined. A falsehood could now move faster than armies, last longer than rulers, and shape the assumptions of entire populations who never meet those who benefit from it. So when we speak of the journey from survival trick to world system, the phrase is not metaphorical, it is literal. A capability once tied to hunger, fear, status, or blame becomes embedded in empires, markets, bureaucracies, educational systems, and media ecologies. It is scaled, refined, moralized, legalized, monetized, and automated. But it is never wholly transformed into something alien. At its core, it remains what it was beside the oldest fire, the attempt to place a version of reality into another human mind, and have them act on that version as though it were true. The modern world, for all its complexity, still runs on that ancient mechanism. Civilization has merely built larger rooms around it. And so the story returns, in a sense, to the beginning, not to a particular campfire, a particular hunter, a particular hidden mouthful of food, or a particular claim made in fear or ambition, because those are gone beyond recovery, but to the deeper threshold that made them possible. The inheritance of the first lie is not a single tradition, institution, or ideology. It is the condition of living in a species that can build reality twice, once in the world itself, and once in the shared interior space of language, memory, and belief. Everything that follows in civilization grows inside that duplication. This inheritance is not only destructive, that is one of the hardest truths in the whole story. The same symbolic power that allows deception also allows law, science, ritual, literature, diplomacy, promises, treaties, accounting, and the transmission of memory across generations. Humans can imagine what does not yet exist and organize themselves toward it. They can create futures before they arrive. They can carry obligations beyond immediate sight. They can tell a child who has never seen the sea what the sea is like. They can preserve the voice of the dead in marks and monuments. None of this is possible without the same cognitive and social architecture that also allows falsehood. The first lie is inseparable from the first large truth that can be shared between absent minds. That is why civilization cannot simply purge deception without also damaging itself. A society that demanded perfect literalism in every context would not become more human. It would become less capable of tact, aspiration, symbolic order, and collective imagination. Yet a society that abandons the distinction between truth and usefulness begins to drift into something else entirely, a place where stories no longer orient people within reality, but detach them from it. The human problem has never been how to eliminate narrative. It has been how to live among narratives without surrendering completely to the most comforting, flattering, or advantageous ones. This tension is visible in every durable institution. Law requires interpretation, but interpretation can be bent. Religion offers meaning, but meaning can be weaponized. Markets require trust in symbols, but symbols can be manipulated. Governments need legitimacy, but legitimacy can harden into myth. Even science, with all its methods for correction, depends on representation, models, and communication, which means it must constantly defend itself against overstatement, bias, and prestige distortion. No part of civilization escapes the inheritance. The question is not whether the first lie is still with us. It is how each era chooses to manage the powers it left behind. What makes the inheritance especially deep is that it does not operate only in institutions. It lives inside ordinary consciousness. Human beings do not merely encounter stories from outside. They are narrating creatures internally as well. They explain themselves to themselves. They smooth memory. They protect identity with selective emphasis. They reinterpret motives after the fact. They take the chaotic materials of experience and shape them into something livable. Sometimes this is wisdom. Sometimes it is self-deception. Often it is both at once. The first lie may therefore survive not only in propaganda, monarchy, bureaucracy, and sacred authority, but in the smallest private acts of mental arrangement by which a person remains able to go on living. This does not make truth meaningless. It makes truth demanding. Truth is hard not because facts never exist, but because facts arrive already entangled with interpretation, interest, fear, and hope. To seek truth in a human world is always to move through representations made by minds like our own, minds capable of care and distortion in equal measure. This is why civilizations build instruments to strengthen honesty beyond individual virtue witness procedures, open records, cross-examination, measurement standards, distributed archives, peer challenge, and collective methods of verification. These are not luxuries added after progress is complete. They are survival tools for a species whose greatest strength can also become its greatest hazard. Scholars still debate just how much of civilization rests on shared fictions, and how sharply those fictions should be separated from lies. The evidence remains incomplete, and no single explanation fully accounts for the range of human arrangements across time. But one conclusion appears again and again with stubborn force. Human beings do not live by brute reality alone. They live by mediated reality, by worlds interpreted, narrated, taught, enacted, and remembered together. This gives them extraordinary reach. It allows tiny, vulnerable primates to organize harvests, ships, legal systems, cathedrals, universities, trade networks, and digital empires. It also means that a distortion introduced at the level of shared belief can travel farther than hunger, weather, or force alone ever could. The inheritance of the first lie is therefore not merely corruption, it is leverage, a dangerous kind of leverage, but leverage all the same. Whoever shapes the accepted version of reality gains influence over labor, loyalty, sacrifice, fear, identity, and time. That has been true of elders, priests, kings, merchants, scribes, party officials, advertisers, teachers, broadcasters, and algorithmic systems. The tools change. The principle does not. Human beings still act, to an astonishing degree, on the world as they believe it to be, and belief remains one of the most contested resources in existence. There is a final irony in all this. The more civilization advances, the more it depends simultaneously on truth and on managed appearances. Modern systems are too complex to run on myth alone, but they are also too vast to function without narrative compression. Most people cannot personally verify the conditions of the food they eat, the money they use, the energy powering their homes, the medical research behind their treatments, or the institutional decisions shaping their lives. They must trust experts, records, procedures, and stories about how these systems work. That reliance is not a flaw, it is unavoidable, but it means the ancient structure remains intact beneath all modern sophistication. We still inhabit realities largely through one another's descriptions. So perhaps the first lie reshaped civilization not because it introduced evil into a previously innocent species, and not because it conquered truth once and for all, but because it revealed the true scale of human power. We are the kind of beings who can move matter with tools, but also move societies with representations. We can build walls, ships, roads, and satellites. We can also build legitimacy, memory, destiny, and fear in the minds of strangers. The first lie is the dark twin of the first promise, the first plan, the first law, and the first myth. All of them arise from the same astonishing human capacity to make absent things socially real. That is the inheritance, not a single cursed sentence echoing through time, but a permanent condition of civilization itself. Every generation receives a world already narrated. Every generation edits that narration, resists parts of it, extends parts of it, mistakes some of it for nature, and discovers too late that some accepted reality was only a convenient arrangement of words and symbols serving someone's need. Then the work begins again to distinguish what is true from what is useful, what is sacred from what is protected by habit, what is law from what is merely power speaking in legal form, what is memory from what is performance. The first lie never ended. It became inheritance because it fused itself to the very medium through which humans cooperate. That is why its legacy is everywhere, and why it remains so difficult to isolate cleanly. We are descendants not only of toolmakers, firekeepers, hunters, farmers, and builders, but of minds that learn to place worlds inside other minds. Civilization rises from that gift. So do its gravest distortions. The story has never really been about choosing one or the other. It has always been about whether human beings can build systems strong enough, humble enough, and honest enough to keep belief from drifting too far away from reality without losing the symbolic powers that made civilization possible in the first place. The night after the first lie would have looked much like the night before it. Wind through grass, fire settling into embers, someone keeping watch while others slept. No monument marked the moment. No voice announced that history had changed. And yet something had changed. Because from then on the human world was no longer made only of stone, hunger, weather, blood, and distance. It was also made of representations of what could be said, believed, repeated, and remembered. That second world has grown larger with every century. It hangs over fields, temples, markets, ports, archives, parliaments, classrooms, screens, and maps. It can comfort the frightened, organize the scattered, and preserve knowledge against oblivion. It can also justify conquest, disguise inequality, and make invented orders feel as permanent as mountains. Most of human history has unfolded in the shifting space between those two possibilities. Perhaps that is why the story lingers, not because we can ever identify the first exact falsehood, but because we recognize its shape everywhere, in the old boast beside the fire, in the royal inscription cut into stone, in the sacred story no one dares question, in the ledger that quietly changes a life, in the official phrase that makes harm sound procedural, in the private explanation a person gives themselves so they can continue into mourning. The forms change, the mechanism remains ancient. Civilization is often described through its visible remains: walls, roads, grain stores, palaces, law codes, shattered statues in desert light. But beneath all of them lies something less visible, and perhaps more decisive: the fragile human ability to share a reality without entirely surrendering that reality to those who would reshape it for advantage. That struggle may be older than any city and more enduring than any empire. And so the final image is not of a throne room or archive, but of a few human beings at the edge of darkness, listening to one another because they have no choice except to trust, and no way to live long without also learning caution. Around them stretches the natural world, indifferent and immense. Between them glows the human world, warmer, stranger, and far more unstable. It is built from stories, warnings, promises, names, memories, and sometimes lies. It is the world that made civilization possible. It is the world we still live in now.